Bloodletting, a practice rooted in the medieval belief that illness stemmed from an excess of blood within the body, became one of the most common and dangerous treatments of the era. Physicians theorized that by removing some of this surplus blood, created around 1446 by the German artist Joseph Heinz, vendors hawk their wares. It's important to remember that not all medical practitioners resorted to such extreme measures. We're going to keep exploring the forgotten corners of history, bringing you stories that bridge the gaps in our collective memory. If you're intrigued by these expeditions into the past, I invite you to join our growing community. Until next time, keep asking questions and stay curious. Some physicians stuck to observation and diagnosis, leaving the actual treatment to God's hands. They prescribed prayers, pilgrimages to holy sites, and above all, a balanced diet of fresh foods, including wine. Your subscription will ensure you never miss an episode. Yet it's crucial to understand the context in which they occurred, cupping and bloodletting. As always, thank you for being part of this journey. However, for many others, the path to health lay in the skillful application of leeches. Bloodletting, the practice of withdrawing blood as a treatment, was especially widespread, but a tapestry woven with threads of faith, so much so that specialized medical instruments were developed for the purpose. In the midst of this lively chaos, lancets became more sophisticated, syringes evolved into complex machines, and the tourniquet, a device used to stop bleeding, made its appearance. This is the apothecary, a place where the lines between healing and horror often blurred. The apothecary, a somewhat unregulated establishment. Imagine the medieval physician arriving at a patient's bedside with a syringe or a set of leeches ready to apply his trade. To those of us today, such practices might seem nothing more than bizarre curiosities of the past, relics of a time when medical science was in its infancy. Medieval medicine, despite its seeming barbarity, was a product of the prevailing knowledge and beliefs of the time. While some turned to alchemy and questionable ingredients, others focused on more conventional methods. Practitioners, armed with little more than observation and tradition, sought to alleviate suffering and prolong life in the best ways they knew, emphasizing lifestyle changes and traditional treatments. The story of medieval medicine is not just one of bloodletting and bizarre remedies. Ignorance and a relentless pursuit of understanding in the face of a world that was often indifferent to human suffering. Townspeople haggle over prices and children dart between the stalls. There stands a booth unlike the rest, shrouded in an eerie silence, served as the primary source of medical treatment for the average medieval citizen. Inside, amidst the dried herbs and mysterious concoctions, lurked a dark secret. The ingredients used in these supposed remedies were not always what they seemed. One common additive was the powder of the dried viper, a small venomous snake. This powder, believed to possess mystical healing properties, was often mixed with other ingredients to form ointments and pills. Imagine the unsuspecting medieval villager consuming a remedy only to be met with the unintended side effect of a venomous bite. But this was not an isolated anomaly. The apothecary's shelves held a variety of questionable substances, from the ground-up remains of bats and toads to extracts derived from the bodies of small animals. Such ingredients, often acquired through questionable means, were seen as potent in treating various ailments. For instance, the eyes of a newt, a small aquatic creature, were thought to be a key ingredient in treating eye disorders. The reality, however, was far from the intended effect. Not only were these substances ineffective in treating any medical condition, but they also posed a risk of introducing toxins into the body. Yet despite the lack of efficacy and the potential for harm, these ingredients were highly sought after and widely used, a testament to the desperate lengths people went to in their pursuit of healing in a time when medical understanding was limited and hope outweighed reason. This work depicts a skeletal figure dancing with a king, A pope and other figures from various walks of life. This macabre dance, a personification of death, serves as a reminder that no matter one's social standing, no one is exempt from mortality. Similarly, the writings of Geoffrey Chaucer in his Canterbury Tales included a vivid description of the Black Death as outbreak, portraying the disease's indiscriminate nature and its effect on society. These artistic expressions, along with countless others, serve as windows into the collective mindset of the late medieval era. Life was precarious and death was ever present. And as we continue our journey into the darker aspects of medieval medicine, it's essential to understand the context of this pervasive reality. The Black Death didn't just shape art and literature. It significantly contributed to the beliefs and attitudes towards health and healing in a time when the causes of disease and the efficacy of treatments were often unclear. People turned to art, literature, and folklore to express their fears, their observations, and their coping mechanisms. And in doing so, they created a legacy that allows us today to better understand the medieval world and the enduring human response to adversity. The body's balance could be restored, leading to a cure. The process itself was anything but simple. It involved making incisions in the patient's arms or legs, using a sharp knife or a lancet. In more extreme cases, the blood was drawn directly from the veins using a pump or a special cup. The bloodletting process was not just a singular action. It was often repeated several times, sometimes to the point where nearly half a liter of blood was removed from a patient. Now, imagine for a moment the aftermath of such a procedure. Not only did this excessive removal of blood weaken the patient further, but it also exposed them to severe infections. The use of unserialized instruments and the already compromised state of the individual. This health made them highly susceptible to blood poisoning. When the incisions became infected, they could lead to gangrenous growths, a horrifying and agonizing way to succumb to illness. This was the harsh reality of those who sought medical aid in medieval Europe. Now, before we delve deeper into the horrors of medieval medicine, I have a question for you. What historical event was so deeply ingrained in the cultural consciousness of the late Middle Ages that it inspired artistic masterpieces, literary tales, and even shaped perceptions of death? Well, if you guessed the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, you'd be right. This catastrophic outbreak of disease that ravaged Europe in the 14th century left an indelible mark on the medieval psyche. Now, why do I bring up this pivotal moment in history? Well, because its impact extended far beyond the realm of public health. It profoundly influenced art, literature, and the very essence of how people viewed mortality. One of the most haunting visual representations of the plague's impact can be found in a painting titled Danse Macabre. Imagine for a moment the bustling marketplace of a medieval town as we continue our descent into the depths of medieval medicine. But our journey through time doesn't end here. Welcome to my channel. Today we're gonna talk about what if yellow and black bile, and that illnesses resulted when there was an imbalance among these four humors. As a result, physicians believed that illnesses could only be cured by removing some of the patient's blood, specifically leeches. There was also the practice of vivisection, which involved opening up a live animal, usually a cat or dog, and then using it as a living model for medical experiments. It's important to remember that they were performed with the best intentions. The physicians of the time genuinely believed that these procedures were helping their patients and saving lives. They were not intentionally causing harm or suffering. It was only after centuries of experimentation and scientific advancement that we discovered the true nature of these illnesses and the ineffectiveness of these treatments. This was done in order to study the anatomy of the body and to test new medical procedures. They played an important role in the history of medicine, from the use of bloodletting to the discovery of anesthesia. Each new development brought us closer to the sophisticated medical care we enjoy today. So the next time you hear someone dismiss the practices of the Middle Ages as nothing but quackery and superstition, remember that it was thanks to these early practitioners that we were able to learn and grow our understanding of the human body and develop the life-saving treatments we rely on today. Only when we learned about the complexities of the human body and the causes of different diseases did we realize that bloodletting was not only useless. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing and joining our community of history lovers. And if you want to learn more about the wacky world of medieval medicine, check out the links below for more videos on the topic. Until next time, stay healthy and happy, but often harmful. But it's important to remember that these physicians were working with the best information they had. They were trying to help their patients and make a difference in the world. In many ways, they were no different than the doctors of today, who are also constantly learning and evolving their understanding of the human body. Just as the practices of the Middle Ages eventually gave way to modern medicine, so too will the practices of today be replaced by new discoveries and innovations tomorrow. The same can be said for purgatives and diuretics. These substances were used for centuries to treat a variety of illnesses, but only with the advent of modern medicine were we able to determine their toxicity and side effects. However, this practice was extremely cruel, and it caused the animals to suffer greatly. It was only done on animals. Physicians had little understanding of anatomy and physiology, and they were unable to test their theories or treatments. This led to a lot of misinformation and ineffective practices being passed down for generations. It was not until the 19th century, with the development of germ theory and the discovery of antibiotics, that our understanding of medicine began to advance rapidly. Because at the time, it was believed that animals did not feel pain the same way that humans did. But today we know that this is not true, and vivisection is no longer allowed in most countries. These segmented aquatic forms with an insatiable appetite for blood became the physicians' allies in the war against humoral imbalance, which were substances that were used to induce vomiting and diarrhea in order to remove corrupt humors from the body. These substances were often extremely toxic, and they could cause serious side effects. But they were used anyway because the benefits of purging were believed to outweigh the risks. For example, one common purgative was mercury, which is a heavy metal that is highly poisonous. But despite the fact that mercury can cause brain damage, blindness, and death, it was still used to treat a variety of illnesses, including syphilis and kidney disease. Another common purgative was antimony, which is a metallic element that is also highly poisonous. Antimony can cause tremors, delirium, and death, but it was still used to treat conditions like gout and jaundice. And finally, there was the use of diuretics, which were substances that were used to increase urine production in order to remove corrupt humors from the body. Diuretics could be helpful in treating certain conditions like edema and kidney disease, but they could also cause dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Despite the risks, diuretics were used widely during the Middle Ages. One common diuretic was aqua tofana, which was a powder that was made from a variety of herbs and minerals. Aqua tofana was believed to be a safe and effective way to increase urine production, but it also contained a small amount of arsenic, which is a highly poisonous substance. Despite this, aqua tofana was used widely throughout Europe, and it is believed that some people even used it as a way to poison their enemies. These slimy creatures were collected from ponds and streams, then carefully applied to the patient's skin, where they would attach themselves and begin their ghastly feast. The sight of a patient covered in writhing leeches, their bodies slowly swelling with stolen blood, must have been deeply disturbing to witness. Yet physicians praised this method for its supposed precision, claiming that leeches would instinctively know exactly how much blood to remove. In reality, these creatures simply fed until they were satiated with no regard for the patient's well-being or survival. which was believed to be in excess of one of the four humors. Bloodletting, therefore, was performed not only to cure illnesses, but also to prevent them. Regular bloodletting was recommended for almost everyone, regardless of whether or not they were sick. I told you that doctors actually used to cover their patients in leeches and then put hot flaming cups on their skin. What? But the most common method was through the use of leeches. In fact, physicians would sometimes use scarification or cupping to draw blood to the surface of the skin. Scarification involved making small incisions on the patient's body, while cupping involved applying a heated glass cup to the skin to draw blood to the surface. Both methods were painful and dangerous, and they often led to infection. But they were seen as necessary evils in order to restore the balance of humors. Leeches are segmented aquatic worms that have an insatiable appetite for blood. They were collected from ponds and streams around Europe, and then they were carefully applied to the patient's skin using a small incision or abrasion. Once attached, the leech would begin its ghastly feast, drinking its fill of the patient's blood before falling off once it was satiated. The number of leeches used varied depending on the severity of the patient's symptoms, but it wasn't uncommon for a single patient to have dozens of leeches applied to their body. That doesn't sound like something that would happen today, but believe it or not, this used to be standard practice among physicians across Europe during the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, bloodletting was an extremely common practice among physicians who believed that the body was governed by four humors: balance, phlegm. The methods used to perform bloodletting varied widely. The use of leeches wasn't the only way that bloodletting was performed. Perhaps the most unsettling method of bloodletting involved the use of living creatures as medical instruments. But the use of live creatures in medical procedures didn't end there. There was also the use of purgatives, the dark side of medical procedures during the Middle Ages. While some of these practices may seem shocking and barbaric to us today, take bloodletting, for example. It was widely practiced for hundreds of years and was seen as a cure-all for a variety of illnesses. It is also important to remember that medical knowledge during the Middle Ages was limited by the technology and resources available at the time. It may seem easy to look back on the practices of the Middle Ages and mock them. While the medical practices of the Middle Ages may seem barbaric and outdated to us today, thank you for watching this video. What do you think about when you hear the word surgery? For most people, modern surgical procedures conjure up images of sterile operating rooms. Conditions like epilepsy, mental illness, headaches, and even eye disorders were all treated in the same way through a process known as trepidation. Today, we're going to discuss this gruesome practice. But before we get started, be sure to hit that like button for more videos. Also, stick around until the end to learn about a disgusting medical marvel that will make your blood run cold. Hand-crank drills with rough metal beds would slowly bore through the skull bone while the patient remained conscious, as effective anesthesia did not exist. The grinding sound of metal against bone, combined with the patient's screams of agony, must have created a scene from the deepest nightmares. Was because they had very little else to offer patients suffering from mental and physical ailments. As scientific understanding of the human body was limited, doctors were unable to develop effective treatments for many conditions. This would create a hole that allowed the trapped vapors or humors to escape. The size and location of the hole varied depending on the condition being treated. Barbers were often the first point of contact for many people seeking medical treatment, and they were trained to perform basic procedures like bloodletting and wound care. They also played a role in the surgical theater. While the methods and motivations for performing the procedure have changed dramatically over time, the underlying goal remains the same: to help alleviate human suffering. Assisting surgeons by preparing patients and instruments, and even acting as surgeons themselves in some cases. However, barbers lacked the extensive training of physicians. Medieval doctors were interested in treating a wide range of ailments, and they believed that the key to curing diseases lay in balancing the body's humors. To that end, they developed a whole host of bizarre and sometimes downright terrifying treatments, which they believed could cure everything from poison to cancer, but they were a testament to the medieval doctors' willingness to try anything to help their patients. What do you think about medieval medicine? Do you know of any other bizarre treatments that were popular at the time? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next time. This was because they believed that the suffering and death of the criminal could be transformed into healing power through the proper application of medical knowledge. In reality, unicorn horn was just the tusk of a narwhal whale, but medieval doctors were none the wiser. They believed that the mythical creature's horn was so pure and powerful that it could neutralize any poison and heal any disease. Of course, this was also not true, but that didn't stop people from trying it. And their involvement in trepanation likely contributed to the high rate of complications and deaths associated with the procedure. This was because they believed that pearls were formed from the concentrated essence of moonlight and rainwater, which gave them special healing powers. Of course, this was not actually true, but that didn't stop wealthy patients from taking pearl therapy. Doctors believed that the vapors causing illness escaped from the upper part of the skull, near the forehead or parietal bones, and they are performed in highly controlled environments with advanced technology and pain management techniques. Once the hole was made, the patient was usually given a herbal mixture to promote healing and prevent infection. The vapors would then be able to escape from the skull, and the patient's condition would improve. They were also heavily influenced by religious beliefs, which often attributed illnesses to supernatural causes. The process of making a hole in the skull was incredibly painful and dangerous. Not only did it expose the brain to potential infection, but it also caused massive blood loss and severe tissue damage. Patients often died from shock, hemorrhage, or sepsis following the procedure. Those who survived were frequently left with permanent disabilities, including paralysis, blindness, and dementia. Despite the horrific outcomes, the practice of trepanation persisted for centuries. This led to treatments that were often more harmful than helpful, such as strupation. Some physicians preferred to use a technique called scraping, which involved using a rough metal instrument to gradually wear away portions of the skull until a hole was created. This method was considered more controlled than drilling, but it prolonged the patient's suffering considerably as the procedure could take hours to complete. The circular pieces of bone removed during trepanation were sometimes kept as medical specimens or even fashioned into amulets believed to possess healing properties. These grisly souvenirs served as reminders of the physician's skill and the patient as suffering, though they provided no actual medical benefit to anyone. Highly skilled surgeons wearing masks and other protective clothing and advanced technology that can save lives. However, medical science was not always so sophisticated. Trepanation continued to be widely practiced until the 18th century. Medieval physicians were convinced that their theoretical understanding of humoral medicine justified even the most extreme interventions. They believed that the benefits of releasing trapped vapors and balancing the humors outweighed the risks associated with performing the procedure. This treatment was popular from the Middle Ages to the late 18th century and was designed to relieve pressure and allow harmful substances to escape from the head. Doctors believed that many mental and physical ailments resulted from trapped vapors or corrupted humors within the skull. The procedure may have helped to relieve pressure and reduce symptoms associated with conditions like epilepsy and mental illness. However, the vast majority of patients died either during the procedure or from subsequent infections. Those fortunate enough to survive often suffered from permanent brain damage, seizures, or other neurological complications that left them worse off than before the surgery. Despite these grim outcomes, Physicians continued to recommend and perform trepidation throughout the medieval period. Conditions like epilepsy, mental illness, headaches, and even eye disorders were all thought to be caused by an imbalance of these substances. And the only way to fix it was to create an opening to let them escape. In medieval Europe, doctors believed that many mental and physical ailments resulted from trapped vapors or corrupted humors within the skull. The Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all used the procedure to treat a variety of different conditions. In most cases, however, it was reserved for the most extreme circumstances and was only performed after other methods had failed. During the Middle Ages, the practice became much more widespread and was used much more liberally. Medieval physicians were influenced by the Greek theory of humorism, which held that the body was governed by 4 humors or fluids: blood, phlegm, black, and yellow bile. According to this theory, disease resulted from an imbalance of these humors and could be corrected by restoring them to their proper balance. Trepidation was thought to be an effective means of removing corrupted blood and other noxious substances from the body. Trepidation, literally meaning an opening or hole, was a medical procedure performed on the human skull. Physicians first recorded instances of trepidation dating back to ancient civilizations. The tools used for trepidation were crude by any standard and resembled instruments of torture more than medical devices, despite the excruciating pain and high risk involved. Another reason why doctors in medieval Europe resorted to such extreme measures, there is some evidence that trepidation may have been effective in certain circumstances. In a small percentage of cases, the trepanation process began with the doctor making an incision in the scalp and then using a special tool to drill or scrape away a portion of the skull. However, this was rarely the case. During the Middle Ages, trepanation was performed by both physicians and barbers. The popularity of trepanation waned in the late 18th century as scientific understanding of the human body improved and more effective treatments were developed. Trepanation has a long and gruesome history, but its use today is a testament to the medical profession's commitment to improving the human condition. But it wasn't just the skull that physicians believed needed to be opened up. For instance, they believed that crushed pearls could cure a wide range of ailments, from infertility to epilepsy. Medieval doctors were also fond of prescribing unicorn horn. They even tried using the ground-up remains of executed criminals to treat various ailments. Finally, medieval doctors were also big fans of animal-based remedies. Of course, these treatments were often more harmful than helpful. Now it's time to hear from you. Spiderwebs as medicine, astrology as therapy, and surgery as torture. These are just a few of the ways that medical science progressed during the Dark Ages, but how did these bizarre treatments come about? What were the common ailments of medieval life? And how did people go about curing them? However, rather than treating these conditions, medieval society often resorted to blaming and punishing those who suffered from them. The use of bloodletting to cure everything from headaches to mental illness. Muslim scholars made significant contributions to the field of medicine, limiting the understanding of human anatomy and physiology. This lack of knowledge led to misconceptions and misunderstandings about the human body, which in turn affected the development of medical science. For example, the incorrect belief that the heart was the seat of emotions limited understanding of hygiene and the prevalence of communicable illnesses. It is estimated that the plague killed around 25 million people, roughly 1/3 of Europe's population. The devastation caused by the plague prompted desperate measures to seek a cure. They reflected the intellectual and cultural context of the medieval world. Astrology and alchemy were not seen as separate from medicine, but rather as integral parts of it. The practitioners of these arts were highly respected members of society, and their influence on medical thinking was profound. However, these practices were not without their critics. As scientific thinking began to emerge during the Renaissance, figures like Andreas Vesalius and Paracelsus challenged the prevailing astrological and alchemical beliefs. They advocated for a more empirical and rational approach to medicine, emphasizing the importance of observation, experimentation, and the study of human anatomy. Over time, this shift in thinking led to the decline of astrology and alchemy as influence on medical practice and paved the way for modern scientific medicine. One such treatment was the wearing of a necklace made of garlic and other aromatic herbs, which was believed to ward off the disease. Nevertheless, it marked a significant step forward in the history of medicine and laid the foundation for the development of more effective and evidence-based treatments. While it is easy to dismiss medieval medical practices as barbaric and outdated, it is essential to understand them within the context of the time. The fusion of astrology and alchemy with medicine may seem bizarre to us now, but it was a reflection of the broader intellectual and cultural trends of the era. The quest to understand and treat diseases like the plague, smallpox, and leprosy led to some extreme and often ineffective measures. Yet it also spurred innovation and the exchange of ideas between cultures, laying the groundwork for future discoveries. The eventual decline of these practices paved the way for the rise of scientific medicine, but their influence and legacy continued to resonate for centuries. As we look back at the history of medicine, it is crucial to examine not only the triumphs and breakthroughs, but also the failures and missteps that shape the path we have taken. The unsettling practices of medieval medicine serve as a reminder of the importance of critical thinking, scientific inquiry, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge in the face of ignorance and superstition. Similarly, during smallpox outbreaks, people turned to inoculation as a means of prevention. Smallpox was a viral disease that caused fever, rash, and severe illness. Inoculation involved exposing a person to a small amount of the virus in the belief that it would stimulate the body to develop immunity against the disease. Among the most notorious diseases of the era were the plague, smallpox, leprosy, and tuberculosis. Astrology, the belief that the positions of celestial bodies influence human affairs, held a strong grip on medieval thinking. Physicians believed that the movements of the planets and stars had a direct influence over human health. This belief led to the practice of medicine being heavily influenced by the zodiac and the timing of treatments, being carefully calculated to align with favorable astrological conditions. These diseases not only ravaged the population, but also fueled the development of some of the most bizarre and unsettling medical practices. An intellect hindered the progress of neurological studies and the understanding of the brain's functions, laying the groundwork for many modern practices. Who revolutionized the study of anatomy through his detailed dissections, experimentation, and mystical practices. Alchemists believed that all matter was composed of 4 elements: earth, air, and water, and that these elements could be transformed through various processes. In the context of medicine, alchemy led to the development of elixirs and potions that were believed to have healing properties. The remnants of these ancient practices lingered in medical thinking for centuries, and it was mentee until the 19th century that scientific medicine truly began to take hold. Despite the setbacks caused by religious dogma and the persistence of superstitious beliefs, the medieval period did witness some advancements in medical knowledge and practice. The works of Muslim scholars, the rediscovery of ancient Greek medical texts, and the introduction of printing all contributed to the growth and dissemination of medical knowledge during this era. Furthermore, the establishment of hospitals and the training of physicians in specialized areas such as surgery and obstetrics marked significant steps forward in the organization and delivery of healthcare, paved the way for a more rational and evidence-based approach to medicine. Vesalius' meticulous anatomical studies corrected many of the misrepresentations of human anatomy that had persisted since ancient times. His work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, became the standard anatomical text for over a century, and his influence on the future of medical science was profound. Their emphasis on observation and reason served as a beacon of enlightenment during a time when superstition and ignorance often overshadowed medical science. The Canon of Medicine was a comprehensive medical encyclopedia that was used in both Muslim and Christian universities for centuries. His contributions to the understanding of infectious diseases and the use of clinical observation and diagnosis were particularly groundbreaking. This misguided belief led to the use of bloodletting for an array of ailments, sometimes with disastrous consequences. For instance, individuals suffering from headaches or mental illness were subjected to bloodletting, which weakened their bodies and left them more vulnerable to infection and other complications, with those afflicted often being seen as possessed by demons or cursed by God. This misguided understanding led to cruel and inhumane treatment, beatings, and even imprisonment in asylums where they were shackled to walls without proper care or treatment. This dark chapter in history serves as a reminder of the importance of empathy, understanding, and scientific inquiry in combating ignorance and superstition. We'll explore the world of medieval medicine and find out how ancient beliefs and superstitions combined to create some truly terrifying cures. Whether incurred through warfare, occupational hazards, or simple misadventure, wounds were a fact of life and carried with them the risk of infection and long-term complications. To address this common ailment, medieval physicians turned to a variety of treatments, some more outlandish than others. One of the strangest and most enduring treatments for wounds was the application of spiderweb as a bandage. This peculiar remedy was born out of observation. Physicians noted that when insects flew into spiderwebs, they became trapped and eventually died. From this, they reasoned that spiderwebs must possess a power that could trap and destroy evil humors, and the belief that they would absorb the bad humors and allow the good ones to flourish. However, this practice, while seemingly bizarre to us now, reflected a deeper understanding of the natural world that existed during the Middle Ages. Physicians were keen observers of the natural world around them and often incorporated their findings into their medical practice. This was both a strength and a weakness of medieval medicine. While it led to some innovative treatments, it also made physicians susceptible to the influence of superstition and folklore. The rise of new kingdoms and the influence of the Catholic Church all contributed to shaping the societal norms and values of the era. During this time, scientific thinking began to take root, but it was often overshadowed by religious beliefs and folklore. Consequently, the medical practices of the era were a strange mix of empirical observation and superstition. As we continue our journey through the disturbing world of medieval medicine, we encounter yet another unsettling practice. Despite these advancements, the medieval period remained largely hostile to the idea of human dissection. Religious doctrine prohibited the dissection of human bodies. The birth of scientific thinking during the Renaissance eventually led to a decline in the influence of astrology and alchemy on medical practice. Figures like Andreas Vesalius, the medieval world was a breeding ground for diseases due to a combination of factors such as poor sanitation. The plague, also known as the Black Death, was a bubonic plague pandemic that swept through Europe in the 14th century. In the face of such widespread suffering and death, it is not surprising that medieval people turned to astrology and alchemy in their search for answers and cures. Alchemy, on the other hand, was a philosophical and proto-scientific tradition that sought to understand the nature of substances through a combination of observation. This transition was not a smooth or rapid process, and the remnants of astrological and alchemical beliefs continued to persist in medical thinking for centuries. In conclusion, the medieval period was a complex and multifaceted era that left an indelible mark on the history of medicine. In the dark and dank depths of medieval dungeons, where flickering torchlight revealed damp stone walls, there existed a different kind of doctor. Forget leeches and purgatives. The liver was thought to be the center of blood production. Blood, a substance physicians had long categorized as one of the four humors. They were trained to deal with blood and wounds and generally had a good understanding of anatomy. By contrast, barbers were generally not allowed to operate unless absolutely necessary, such as in cases of gunshots or gangrene. But when they did perform operations, they usually had better results than doctors or surgeons. Patients were typically left to manage their own recovery, with little to no follow-up care, based on the belief that isolation from external stimuli would allow their minds to heal naturally. Physicians believed that shocking the patient's system through pain might restore the proper balance of humors in the brain. This led to brutal sessions where patients were whipped, burned, or subjected to other forms of torture in the name of medical care. Such practices not only failed to cure mental disorders, some fled to isolated areas believing that distance from the sick could offer safety. Others experimented with drastic diets, born out of a lack of understanding and reinforced by deeply ingrained beliefs. If you think the methods used by these torturer doctors were barbaric, or if there's something else you think of, check out this video next. Until then, I'll see you later. What might seem cruel and unusual today was once considered the best available course of action. By studying these practices, not with judgment, but with understanding, we gain insight into the evolution of medical thought and the challenges faced by those who came before us, hoping to alter their humors to resist the plague. Still others embrace radical religious practices, seeking divine intervention or confessing their sins in hopes of appeasing a wrathful God. These desperate measures, born out of fear and ignorance, not only failed to stop the plague, but became yet another chapter in the grim narrative of medieval medicine, but also inflicted severe physical and psychological trauma on patients, leaving them with permanent disabilities and exacerbating their pre-existing conditions. The reality was that such confinement often led to further deterioration of the patient's mental state. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed an estimated 1/3 of the population and revealed the complete helplessness of medieval medicine in the face of infectious disease. Physicians had no understanding of how the plague spread or what caused it, leading to a proliferation of theories that ranged from astrological explanations to divine punishment for human sins, creating a cycle of worsening symptoms and increasingly harsh treatments, resulting in interventions that often hastened death rather than promoting recovery. Bloodletting was employed extensively during plague outbreaks, based on the belief that the disease resulted from corrupted humors that needed to be expelled from the body. Weakened plague victims were subjected to massive blood loss that left them even less capable of fighting off the infection, contributing to the astronomical mortality rates observed during epidemic periods. Other plague treatments included the burning of aromatic substances to purify the air, the wearing of protective amulets and charms, and the consumption of various herbal preparations believed to strengthen the body as natural defenses. None of these interventions had any real effect on the course of the disease, and many may have actually increased the risk of infection by encouraging people to remain in contaminated areas rather than fleeing to safer locations. During this confinement periods, patients were denied basic necessities like food and water, and were frequently subjected to sensory deprivation and forced to endure inhumane conditions. This approach was based on the flawed assumption that the mind could be healed through extreme isolation, but in actuality, it often had the opposite effect, exacerbating the patient's condition and causing lasting psychological damage, leaving them vulnerable to complications and secondary infections. If they survived the initial surgery, many succumbed to the aftermath due to the absence of proper medical attention. The treatment of mental illness in medieval times was particularly barbaric, reflecting a complete lack of understanding about the nature of psychological disorders. Mental patients were often believed to be possessed by demons or evil spirits, leading to treatments that focused on driving out these supernatural influences rather than addressing any underlying medical conditions. This was mainly due to the fact that they worked with blood every day. These ceremonies could last for days or weeks, with patients subjected to constant prayers, holy water, and various religious artifacts intended to repel evil influences. The physical and psychological stress of such treatments often worsened the patient's condition significantly. When religious treatments failed to produce results, physicians might resort to more aggressive physical interventions, and therefore gained a greater understanding of the circulatory system than those who rarely performed surgery. As a result, they knew how to avoid major blood vessels and other internal organs, reducing the risk of death during surgery. Was generated in the liver and coursed through the body via an intricate network of veins and arteries. But it's clear from written accounts and personal stories that the practice occurred in England, France, and Germany. One example is the case of John of Burgundy, who traveled to Paris in the late 1260s for treatment of a gunshot wound to his foot. He received treatment from a barber surgeon, a man of great experience and skill, highlighting the recognition of the barber's expertise in this field. Such partnerships between barbers and surgeons may have provided better outcomes for patients during a time when medical knowledge was limited. But they also reveal the uncomfortable truth that in the absence of proper training, even the most basic surgical procedures carried significant risks. These blood vessels were believed to carry entirely different types of fluid throughout the body. Veins were thought to contain melancholic blood, and operations were performed without anesthesia, meaning patients were wide awake and feeling all the pain. Instruments were often unsterilized, increasing the risk of infection, and the lack of understanding of basic hygiene principles meant that surgeons could introduce contaminants into wounds, further complicating recoveries. In this environment, surviving surgery was a remarkable feat, but the risk of death remained ever present. Responsible for functions like digestion, while arteries circulated the more fiery blood, vital for movement and energy. The heart acted as the primary organ for this process. Situated near the center of the chest, believed to be composed of both flesh and blood. It was this organ that served as the seat of emotions like courage and anger. This physician carried no silver tongue or purging potion. His instruments of torture were far more sinister, crafted not to heal, but to harm. Enter the torturer, doctor of a different sort. And let's jump right into it. While the brain was considered primarily a cooling system for the blood, such anatomical ignorance made surgical procedures even more dangerous than they would have been under the best of circumstances. Physicians operating on patients had only the vaguest understanding of what they might encounter inside the body, leading to countless instances of accidental damage to vital organs and blood vessels. A cut too deep or a misplaced incision could easily result in death, not because the procedure itself was impossible, but simply due to the surgeon's lack of knowledge about the human form. Operations therefore carried a high mortality rate, making surgery a risky endeavor. Despite the danger, however, some procedures were deemed necessary, such as the removal of bullets or the treatment of wounds that defied healing. The stakes were high, the knowledge base was low, and the consequences of error were often fatal. The most successful surgeries were performed by barbers who had apprenticed with surgeons. It's difficult to know exactly how widespread the barber-surgeon collaboration was across medieval Europe. Records are spotty at best. Surgical techniques themselves were rudimentary at best. To make matters worse, after-surgery care was equally substandard. Exorcism was a common treatment for mental illness, involving prolonged rituals designed to force demonic entities to abandon their human hosts. Patients were sometimes chained in dungeons or cellars for extended periods. Beating and other forms of physical abuse were also considered legitimate medical treatments for mental illness. The medieval period also saw the rise of epidemic diseases that challenged the limited medical knowledge of the time and exposed the inadequacy of contemporary treatments. Treatment attempts were based on these flawed theories. As the death toll mounted, so did the desperation. People turned to anything and anyone who offered hope, however false, in search of a cure. As we reflect on these historical practices, it's essential to remember that they were products of their time. Let me know in the comments below. As we journey deeper into the labyrinth of medieval medicine, we find ourselves confronted with one of the most disconcerting aspects of this bygone era: the common folk, comprising the majority of medieval society. These practices, passed down through generations of healers, formed the basis of medical knowledge and were rarely questioned. The prevailing medical theories, often rooted in the works of ancient Greek and Roman scholars like Galen and Hippocrates, were accepted as absolute truth. The prevailing understanding of human anatomy was heavily influenced by the teachings of Galen, the ancient Greek physician whose work was based on the dissection of animals rather than humans. This resulted in a distorted view of human anatomy. The absence of outcry during medieval medical procedures was not just a product of religious beliefs, social norms, or anatomical misconceptions. It is important to remember that their silence was not a sign of resignation or submission, but a product of their circumstances. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to show your support. Your engagement helps us bring more historical tales to life. The medieval patient was trapped in a web of societal, religious, and economic pressures that left them with no room to question, resist, or even scream. Their silence was a testament to the power of these forces, a stark reminder of the lengths to which societal structures can go to maintain their dominance. And as we reflect on this haunting aspect of medieval life, we are left to wonder how much of this silence still echoes in our modern world. How many times have we, like the medieval patient, been unable to speak up due to societal pressures or imbalances of power? Understanding the silence of medieval patients is not just a journey into the past. It's a mirror held up to our present, urging us to listen to the voices that remain unheard. It was also deeply entwined with the economic realities of the time. Medical practice during the Middle Ages was, for lack of a better term, a business. Physicians, especially those in private practice, were motivated not only by a desire to heal, but also by the pursuit of profit. The cost of medical treatments varied widely depending on the status of the patient and the severity of their illness. For poorer patients, basic treatments like herbal remedies or dietary advice might be within reach. However, as the complexity of the ailment increased, so did the price tag. Bloodletting, purging, and surgical interventions, considered the most effective treatments in medieval medicine, were highly expensive. These procedures not only required specialized skills and rare materials, but also consumed a great deal of the physician's time. Therefore, they were not only the most potent treatments, but also the most lucrative. This economic incentive encouraged physicians to steer their patients towards these high-cost procedures, regardless of whether they were truly necessary. After all, a full recovery without bloodletting or surgery was not only unlikely, which in turn affected the way illnesses were diagnosed and treated. The medieval patient, operating under a flawed understanding of their own body, would have had no frame of reference to question the manipulations or interventions performed by physicians. Moreover, the medieval worldview was deeply influenced by the concept of balance, particularly the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. This theory held that the proper balance of these humors was essential for good health, and any imbalance would lead to illness. Treatments such as bloodletting, which aimed to restore this balance, were seen as beneficial. Thus, the patient's silence was not merely a response to their circumstances, but a reflection of their understanding of the world around them. The concept of challenging established medical wisdom would have been unthinkable to the medieval mind. During the Middle Ages, physicians were generally exempt from criminal prosecution for their medical practices, even if those practices resulted in harm or death. This immunity granted to them by both church and state allowed doctors to experiment with various treatments without fear of reprisal, often to the detriment of their patients. One that prioritized novel theories and drastic measures over tried and tested methods. This legal protection, intended to foster innovation in the field of medicine, inadvertently created an environment where patients were mere subjects for testing, their bodies sacrificed to the ambitions of physicians eager to make a name for themselves. But the influence of these ancient authorities was not just confined to the realm of medical theory. It extended to the very tools and techniques used in medical practice. Take, for instance, the lancet, a simple yet indispensable instrument used for bloodletting, a cornerstone of medieval medicine. The use of the lancet can be traced back to the ancient Egyptians, and its continued use throughout medieval times is a testament to the reverence for traditional practices. Similarly, the leeches, those small parasitic worms used to suck out blood, have their roots in ancient Greek medicine. Medieval physicians, steeped in the belief that balancing the body's humors was essential for health, eagerly adopted these ancient methods. The blind acceptance of tradition extended to other areas of medical practice as well. Surgical interventions, often more akin to mutilation than healing, were performed using techniques that had remained unchanged for centuries. Instruments used in these procedures were often as crude as they were ineffective, and the lack of anesthesia meant that pain was an unavoidable part of the experience. Yet patients submitted to these torturous procedures without complaint, not because they embraced suffering, but because they had no other option. Lives defined by toil and hardship. The Christian doctrine of the time held that illness and pain were often seen as forms of divine punishment for sins or misfortunes. In this context, suffering was not something to be avoided or mitigated, but a test of faith and a path to spiritual enlightenment. The concept of martyrdom, where extreme suffering was endured for religious beliefs, was a central tenet of Christianity. Therefore, when faced with excruciating medical procedures, the medieval patient was often driven to view their ordeal as a necessary sacrifice for their soul's salvation. Moreover, the religious framework of the era discouraged questioning the will of God. This deference to a higher power extended to the natural world as well. Natural phenomena were seen as manifestations of divine power, and human attempts to understand or control these forces were often seen as presumptuous. In this environment, the idea of questioning established medical practices would have been seen as challenging the divine order, thus making it unthinkable to most medieval patients. Their days were spent in the exhausting labor of agriculture or menial trades, and their nights were often spent in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. For these individuals, the threat of illness was ever present, and when it struck, it brought with it not only physical suffering, but also the risk of destitution and death. Within this context, the decision to seek medical aid was often driven by desperation rather than choice. When a person fell ill, they had little understanding of the causes of their ailment or the nature of the proposed treatments. They placed their trust in the physician, not because of any personal choice, but due to a profound lack of alternatives. It was not a matter of weighing various treatment options or selecting a preferred method of care. It was simply a case of submitting to whatever intervention was offered as the only glimmer of hope for recovery. This power dynamic between physician and patient was further complicated by the social divide that existed between the two groups. Physicians, especially those from the ranks of the nobility, were educated, urban, and religiously sanctioned members of society. They occupied a position of authority that was reinforced by their knowledge of advanced medical theories and their use of sophisticated instruments. Patients, on the other hand, were largely uneducated in medical matters and were often too poor to afford basic literacy. This stark contrast in education meant that the average person had no way of comprehending the rationale behind medical treatments or questioning the methods employed by physicians. It was simply beyond their realm of understanding. The eerie silence of patients in the face of excruciating pain and disfigurement. In this age where medical interventions were not only invasive but frequently deadly, the question arises, where were the screams? Why did patients endure such torment without a sound? To answer this chilling query, we must delve into the complex interplay of factors that define medieval society, religion, power dynamics, education, and economics. All of these elements combine to create a world where patients were not just passive recipients of medical treatment, but active participants in a system that demanded obedience, submission, and an almost supernatural level of tolerance for pain. The conspicuous absence of outcry during painful procedures becomes more comprehensible when viewed against the backdrop of medieval life. One must consider the rigid social hierarchy of the time. In the absence of scientific method, medieval physicians relied heavily on ancient texts and time-honored traditions. Religion played a pivotal role in shaping the attitudes towards pain and suffering in medieval society. The medieval view of the body itself contributed significantly to the silence surrounding pain. Furthermore, the legal and ethical structures of the time played a significant role in the dynamics between physicians and patients, but the story does not end here. As we come to the end of our exploration into the silence of medieval medical patients, thank you for joining me on this journey through time. You've heard stories of medieval medicine gone wrong, right? Like bloodletting, where doctors would drain the body of blood to cure illnesses, sometimes accidentally killing people in the process, but it also made us realize there's something we missed. We focused too much on the physical side effects of draining someone as blood and not enough on the mental ones. She didn't have dementia. She was going through a divorce and was experiencing a very normal bout of depression that goes away on its own given time. When things go wrong in any other profession, the worst that usually happens is you get a refund or a replacement product. Instead, they used a combination of superstition and religious doctrine. But doctors kept doing them because they were based on deeply held beliefs, not empirical evidence. This meant that if you went to a medieval doctor with a problem like depression, he's been practicing medicine for decades and has a long list of successful treatments under his belt. So we decided to put his skills to the test and let him diagnose us. It's the story of a 32-year-old Afghan man who went to Aga for treatment. He had been experiencing symptoms of depression, including fatigue, insomnia, and feelings of hopelessness. After examining him, Aga diagnosed him with an imbalance of the four humors and prescribed treatment, bloodletting. They wouldn't try to help you by prescribing therapy or medication. They can be beneficial, but they can also be harmful. It is important to be aware of both sides so that we can make informed decisions about the care we receive. Eventually, he was referred to a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with major depressive disorder and prescribed him medication. For example, acupuncture, a traditional Chinese practice, has been shown to be effective in treating conditions such as chronic pain and anxiety. It's important to be aware of the potential effects of medical traditions before trying them out. Other medical traditions focus on the use of diet and exercise to treat mental illness. We're always coming out with new videos about the dark side of history, including the Inquisition, witch trials, serial killers, and more. We cover everything from bloodletting to the Black Death and beyond. I'm your host. Don't forget to keep on thinking. This can have a positive impact on people's mental health by helping them to live healthier lifestyles. In this case, the patient was able to find some relief from his symptoms through bloodletting, but ultimately he needed modern medical treatment. Let's just say we're glad we never followed through with it. Many of them have been shown to have positive effects. For example, Ayurveda, a traditional Indian system of medicine, has been shown to have effective treatments for certain conditions. This can lead to treatments such as bloodletting and the use of herbal medicine, which can have negative side effects. For example, bloodletting can cause anemia and weakness, and some herbs can be toxic. But as we were leaving, we couldn't help but wonder what would happen if we actually followed through with his treatment plan. Instead, they would try to balance your humors with bloodletting, or they would perform an exorcism to purge you of evil. And these practices weren't just performed on people who were mentally ill. They found that many of these traditions have a negative impact on people's mental health. For example, in some cultures, people who experience mental illness are seen as being possessed by demons. This leads to exorcisms and other forms of torture being used to treat mental illness. They were performed on anyone who had a condition that baffled medieval doctors. For example, they believed that diseases were caused by an imbalance of the four humors, which were thought to be the basic elements of the body. They also believed that illnesses were often the result of an imbalance between good and evil. So treatments often involved balancing the humors or purging the body of evil. But in medicine, it's life or death. One wrong diagnosis can have a huge impact on a person's life, especially in the Middle Ages. Well, to find out, we traveled to a place where medieval medicine was still being practiced, Afghanistan. In the remote villages, there's a local healer named Aga who uses traditional methods to treat people's ailments. This means he performs bloodletting, uses herbal medicine, and even practices exorcisms. But she was unlucky because her doctor's diagnosis was wrong. And psychiatrists are so confident in their diagnosis that they don't do second opinions. So this woman started taking medication that she didn't need. So let us dive deeper into the medieval mind and see how bleeding could screw with someone's sanity. Well, what if I told you there's a darker side to this gory history? That's the side that medical historians have largely ignored. Now back to the show. In 2003, a woman went to a doctor complaining of depression, forgetfulness, and some memory loss. They can affect your sleep, your emotions, your vision, your appetite, your energy level, and your balance. Not to mention, they can make you physically dependent on them. And even if you stop taking them, the withdrawal symptoms can be debilitating. The doctor was a well-respected psychiatrist, and after performing a few tests, he diagnosed her with dementia. He then prescribed her medication to treat it. In our recent video on medieval medicine, we got a lot of comments pointing out how dangerous bloodletting was, which is true. But first, welcome to Life Noggin. Now here's the thing. That may not sound like a big deal, but antidepressants have a lot of side effects, especially when you take them long term. I bring up this story because it's a perfect example of why medical mistakes are so bad. See, throughout most of human history, doctors didn't have a scientific way of determining what caused illness. Now, most of these treatments were pretty useless at best and downright deadly at worst. So how did this affect people's minds? We sat down with Aga and asked him about his methods, and it turns out that he is actually really good at what he does. After examining us, he gave us a diagnosis and recommended a treatment. Well, it turns out we don't have to wonder because we found a case study that was published in the Journal of Affective Disorders. The patient underwent a series of bloodletting treatments, and while he initially felt better, his symptoms soon returned. This case study is important because it shows that medical traditions can have a real impact on people's lives. However, this doesn't mean that all medical traditions are bad. This is why it's important to have a nuanced conversation about medical traditions. Medical anthropologists have studied the effects of medical traditions on people's minds and bodies. Other medical traditions are based on the idea that mental illness is caused by an imbalance of the humors. However, some medical traditions have a positive impact on people's mental health. Overall, the impact of medical traditions on people's mental health is mixed. Some traditions can be harmful, while others can be helpful. If you want to learn more about the dangers of medieval medicine, stay tuned for more updates. And if you want to learn more about medieval medicine specifically, check out our recent video on the subject. Thanks for watching. Medical care in medieval Europe, a nightmare of exploitation in the dimly lit halls of medieval hospitals. Amidst the stench of decay and the cries of the afflicted, in medieval Europe, the price of medical care was not fixed. It was a free market determined by the whims and demands of both the physician and the patient. Medicine, like all trades, had to generate income for its practitioners. In an era when societal safety nets were non-existent and starvation or destitution could mean a swift death, this practice, based on the now discredited humor theory, involved the removal of blood to balance the body's humors. The physician, by virtue of their perceived ability to inflict or alleviate suffering, was seen as an agent of God's will. Patients, therefore, were not just recipients of medical care. They were supplicants at the altar of divine retribution and mercy. This power dynamic furthered the medical establishment as authority and made questioning medical advice or treatment tantamount to questioning divine providence. They were not just healers, they were gatekeepers of health. It is essential to recognize that the majority of medieval doctors probably did not consciously prolong their patients' suffering. While the economic incentives were undeniably perverse, the vast majority of physicians probably entered the profession with the genuine intention of alleviating suffering. The problem lay in the system they operated within, a system that incentivized dependence, obscured true costs, and blurred the lines between healing and exploitation. Their knowledge and skills intricately linked to the spiritual, social, and economic realities of the time. The medical practices of medieval Europe were not merely primitive or misguided. They were deeply embedded in the cultural, religious, and financial context of the era. To understand these practices is to understand not just the world of healers and sickness, but also the world of trade, theology, and social hierarchy that defined medieval Europe. The consequences of such questioning could be severe. From a religious standpoint, it took on a new meaning. Bloodletting was no longer just a medical procedure. Serve as a stark reminder of how deeply human experiences are entwined with the systems and structures that shape them. Illness, suffering, and death are universal experiences, but the way we manage them, the meaning we ascribe to them, and the power dynamics that play out around them are as diverse and complex as human society itself. The medical practices of medieval Europe may seem barbaric and exploitative in our modern context, but they were the product of their time, a reflection of the economic, religious, and social realities of a long-gone era. By understanding them, we gain insight not just into the history of medicine, but into the history of humanity itself. They diagnosed illnesses and prescribed treatments not just based on symptoms and ailments, but also on the patient's moral standing. Those who complained about pain or questioned treatments risked being labeled as malingerers, seeking special treatment due to their sinful nature. This wasn't merely a matter of disbelief in the medical methods. It was seen as a direct challenge to the Church's teachings and the natural order. Medical treatment was no longer a transaction of service for payment. It became a sacrament of sorts, a ritual of pain and penance, mediated by a priest-like figure clad in the robes of science. It became a form of purging sin, a physical manifestation of spiritual cleansing. Physicians, especially those working in hospitals, were often respected members of society. This was achieved not just through their actions and expertise, but also through deliberate cultivation of an image. They projected an aura of mystery and importance. They spoke in Latin, a language that was deliberately obscure and inaccessible to the general populace. They surrounded themselves with arcane instruments and mysterious substances, all contributing to an image of medicine as a highly specialized and somewhat secretive practice. These theatrics were not mere vanity. They served to bolster their authority and make medical treatment seem more potent than it may have been in reality. This image also contributed to the mystique of the physician as a healer, giving them a near-divine status in the eyes of the public. They became less human healers and more oracles of health, dispensing remedies not just with their hands, but with their words. This elevation of medical practice furthered the economic interests of physicians by making their services more desirable and thus more expensive. They enjoyed a social standing that gave them considerable influence and power. This social capital was not static. It was constantly cultivated and leveraged by physicians. They cultivated good relationships with the wealthy, influential, and religious leaders, ensuring not just their own advancement, but also the acceptance and effectiveness of their methods. They used their influence to shape local regulations, professional courtesy, and public opinion, all in a way that benefited their profession and protected their economic interests. Similarly, the endurance of illness and pain was viewed through a religious lens. The Church, as emphasis on suffering as a path to spiritual purification, led to a situation where patients were sometimes encouraged to endure excruciating treatments, seeing them as necessary for their spiritual growth. Sickness was an economic burden that individuals and families could ill afford. For the poor, a prolonged illness meant time away from work, dwindling food reserves, and increasing debts. For the middle class, caring for a sick family member could drain their resources and push them into poverty. Hence, the wealthy sought out physicians who would deliver swift and lasting cures, while the poor often had no choice but to endure illnesses that dragged on for months or years. This economic stratification extended to every aspect of medical care. They were deeply embedded in the social fabric of their times. Their practices, beliefs, and even ethics were heavily influenced by a dominant force of the era, the religious establishment. The Church's pervasive influence permeated every aspect of medieval life, including healthcare. The prevailing medical doctrine was firmly rooted in religious belief. Illness, according to this view, was not just a physical ailment, but a spiritual test, a punishment for sin, or an opportunity for redemption. This religious coloring significantly impacted medical practices. The wealthy could afford multiple consultations, allowing them to shop around for physicians who told them what they wanted to hear. They could import medicines from distant lands, hire private nurses, and retreat to country estates to recover in relative comfort. The poor, however, had no such luxury. They were at the mercy of whatever treatment was offered to them, often by practitioners with minimal training and no accountability. And the fee structure itself was designed to extract maximum profit from desperate patients. Physicians charged not just for their services, but for each component of their treatments. Every herb, every bloodletting session, every consultation carried a separate cost. Families often bankrupted themselves trying to save a loved one, only to watch them die anyway from the very treatments they had sacrificed everything to afford. There existed a stark disparity of care, a disparity of access, and ultimately, a disparity of life and death. The rich and the poor experienced medical treatment as vastly different realities. This wasn't merely a consequence of limited medical knowledge or rudimentary healthcare infrastructure. It was a structured, intentional system that permeated every facet of medieval medical practice. The first and most evident disparity was economic. This economic model had a perverse incentive. It encouraged the prolonging of illness rather than its cure. A healthy patient was no longer a source of income. Thus, a physician treating a wealthy patient had little motivation to effect a swift recovery. Chronic illness meant a steady revenue stream. And in a system where medical expertise was being bought and sold like any other commodity, the financial interest of the doctor and the well-being of the patient diverged. While this might appear shocking today, in the context of medieval Europe, it makes grim sense. Adding another layer of complexity, medieval physicians didn't operate in a vacuum. Take bloodletting, for instance. This religious framework also had a profound impact on the dynamics between physician and patient. In this religious context, the physician's word was absolute. The social dimension of medieval medical care further blurred the lines between healer and divine judge. Moreover, they shaped the perception of their work in the eyes of the populace. Within this complex web of economics, religion, and social influence, the medieval physician wielded considerable power. And yet, despite the pervasiveness of the system, in the end, the medical horrors of medieval Europe. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're continuing to explore the shadowy realm of medieval medicine in the second episode of our series devoted to uncovering its darkest secrets. Every patient has the right to understand the nature and risks of their treatment, to ask questions and to refuse treatment if they so choose. There was no way for patients to seek redress for the harm they suffered at the hands of physicians. It reminds us that even in the most advanced and sophisticated healthcare systems, the absence of informed consent and patient autonomy can lead to unimaginable abuses of power. It also highlights the importance of continuous scrutiny and accountability in medical practice, no matter how well-intentioned or respected the medical community may be. The physician would typically rely on the prevailing medical theories and treat the condition as a physical imbalance. In doing so, they might ignore the patient's own descriptions of their symptoms and experiences, as well as any insights they might have into the causes of their illness. This disregard for individual experience was particularly damaging for patients who were suffering from mental health conditions. Its impact can be felt in the cultural attitudes and practices that have shaped Western medicine and society for centuries. One of the most enduring legacies of medieval medicine is the idea that effective medicine must be unpleasant. This misconception arose from the medieval belief that illness was caused by an imbalance of the humors. The dark legacy of medieval medicine serves as a cautionary tale, reminding us of the dangers of unchecked authority, the importance of individual experience, and the need for constant vigilance in the face of medical injustice. By understanding the roots of our current attitudes and practices, we can work towards creating a future of medicine that is not only advanced and effective, but also compassionate and equitable for all, and that treatments such as bloodletting and purging were necessary to restore balance. Your support helps us continue to produce engaging and educational content, largely because they were seen as unpleasant enough to be effective. This view of medicine persisted long after the abandonment of the humor theory, and it was only in the 20th century that the idea of pleasant medical treatments began to gain traction. During the medieval period, mental illness was often seen as a sign of demonic possession or witchcraft. As we've discussed, medieval physicians believed they had absolute authority over their patients. It's important to remember that there were always voices of dissent during the medieval period. Physicians like John Huser and Andreas Vesalius dared to challenge the prevailing medical beliefs and practices, paving the way for a more scientific and humane approach to medicine. Their contributions, along with the countless others who sought to improve the human condition, remind us that progress is possible even in the darkest of times, and the increased emphasis on informed consent that patients began to be seen as partners in their own healthcare. Finally, medieval medicine's emphasis on balance and moderation left its mark on the concept of suffering. Medieval physicians believed that a certain amount of suffering was necessary for the body to heal, and they often prescribed treatments that caused unnecessary pain and discomfort. This view of suffering as a necessary part of healing persisted for centuries, and it was only in the late 20th century that the focus shifted to relieving pain and improving the quality of life for patients. And patients were subjected to brutal treatments such as exorcisms and torture. These treatments were based on the belief that mental illness was the result of supernatural forces, not on any understanding of the underlying causes or effective treatments. As a result, patients were not only denied effective treatment. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval medicine, it is essential that we keep this lesson in mind. We must strive to honor the autonomy. There were some individuals during the medieval period who dared to question the prevailing medical orthodoxy. Some physicians, such as Paracelsus, began to challenge the long-held medical beliefs and to advocate for new and more effective treatments. Others, like the Italian Renaissance scientist and polymath Leonardo da Vinci, laying the groundwork for a more empirical and scientific approach to medicine. While these individuals were often met with resistance and skepticism, their efforts represented a crucial step towards a more individualized and patient-centered approach to medicine. It's important to remember that despite the prevalence of harmful practices and beliefs, there were always those who dared to question the status quo and to seek out new and better ways of treating illness and disease. And the stories of those who dared to question the prevailing medical wisdom serve as a reminder that progress in medicine is often hard-won, and that the pursuit of knowledge and compassion for fellow human beings are essential to its advancement. Only then can we hope to build a future of medicine that is not only advanced and effective, but also ethical and humane. The medical profession was highly respected and influential in medieval society, and so any complaints against a physician were likely to be ignored or dismissed. Moreover, the very nature of medical practice made it difficult for patients to know when they were being mistreated. Unlike many modern medical procedures, medieval treatments were often administered without the use of anesthesia. So a patient might not know how much pain they were in or whether or not the treatment was actually helping them. This lack of accountability and transparency led to a situation where medieval medicine became a breeding ground for some of the most horrific and inhumane practices in history. It was an era where physicians were free to experiment with new and terrible treatments, knowing that there was no one to hold them responsible for the suffering they inflicted on their patients. However, during the medieval period, this fundamental principle was non-existent. Physicians saw themselves as having absolute authority over their patients, a godlike power to prescribe and perform whatever treatments they deemed necessary without any input or consent from their patients. We recognize that each person's story is unique and can provide valuable insights into the human condition. However, during the medieval period, individual experience was often disregarded. Physicians were heavily influenced by the prevailing medical theories of the time, such as the theory of the four humors, and they believed that these theories applied universally to all patients. This meant that a patient's individual symptoms and experiences were often seen as irrelevant or even misleading. As a result, patients were often prescribed treatments that were not effective for their particular condition and sometimes even harmful. This lack of bodily autonomy was particularly egregious when it came to women who were often treated as passive recipients of medical procedures, subjected to painful and humiliating examinations and treatments without any say in the matter. The prevailing beliefs of the era viewed physicians as all-knowing authorities. Patients, on the other hand, were expected to be submissive and compliant, placing their trust in their bodies entirely in the hands of their doctors, which was used to treat a wide range of ailments from headaches to epilepsy. During bloodletting, blood was withdrawn from the patient. This practice was based on the medieval theory of the four humors. which held that the body must maintain a balance of four humors or fluids, physicians continued to practice bloodletting for centuries without ever seeking the consent of their patients. They simply saw it as their duty to perform this treatment whenever they deemed it necessary. It was rarely seen as a failure of the treatment itself. Instead, blame was placed on the patient, either for not following instructions correctly or for having a particularly severe case of the illness. In fact, a patient's death was often seen as a testament to the skill of the physician, with the more dramatic the death, the better. A slow and painful death was seen as a sign of a skilled physician who had fought bravely against the illness, while a sudden and unexpected death was seen as a sign of a weak physician who had been defeated easily. This perverse incentive structure led to a situation where physicians had little or no accountability for their actions. There was no one to hold them responsible for the suffering or death of their patients. And so they were free to experiment with new and sometimes horrific treatments with little or no regard for the consequences. In our modern world, the concept of informed consent is a cornerstone of medical ethics. One of the most shocking examples of this lack of informed consent was the routine practice of bloodletting. To make matters even worse, however, this dark chapter in medical history offers us a valuable lesson for our modern times. In our modern world, we highly value individual experiences and perspectives. For example, if a patient presented with symptoms that could be attributed to either a physical imbalance of the humors or a mental disturbance, the legacy of dark medieval medicine extends far beyond the immediate suffering it inflicted. Another enduring legacy of medieval medicine is the notion that patients should not question their doctors. While the dark legacy of medieval medicine continues to shape our attitudes and practices today, as we continue to explore the history of medicine, it's crucial that we learn from both the triumphs and failures of the past. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. In the grim and unforgiving realm of medieval medicine, where the line between healing and harm was perilously thin, in the medieval mind, such conditions were often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment for sin. But in the medieval era, the concept was so foreign to thinking that patients were often treated more like livestock than human beings. When a physician decided that bloodletting was necessary, medical treatments designed for adults were simply scaled down and applied to children, often with devastating results. A child suffering from fever might be bled until they lost consciousness, but it wasn't just the common folk who suffered. Even the wealthy elite, despite having more options available to them, were still subject to the whims of medieval medical practices. This meant that those who suffered at the hands of incompetent or unscrupulous practitioners had little recourse, and were left to bear the physical and financial burdens of their injuries alone. The absence of medical consent meant that patients had no say in the treatments they received, and could not refuse care even if they believed it to be inappropriate or unnecessary. Peasants had virtually no rights in a medical system that was dominated by religious beliefs and medical practices that were often more harmful than helpful. Their lack of autonomy over their own bodies meant that they were subjected to treatments that were not only ineffective, but sometimes resulted in severe injury or even death. Furthermore, the absence of medical liability laws meant that physicians were not held accountable for the harm they caused, which led to a system in which patients were routinely abused and medical knowledge was slow to advance. Ultimately, the story of medical care in the Middle Ages is a cautionary tale, reminding us of the importance of patient rights, medical ethics, and the dangers of unchecked medical authority. It serves as a stark reminder of the progress that has been made over the centuries in protecting the rights and safety of patients, as well as the ongoing need to safeguard against abuses of power in the medical field. This lack of autonomy over their own bodies meant that patients were reduced to passive recipients of medical procedures. unable to advocate for themselves or make decisions that were in their best interest. While they might have had the means to seek multiple opinions or refuse certain treatments, this practice, which involved draining the body of blood through methods such as leeching or venesection, substances that were used to induce vomiting or diarrhea, to treat illnesses such as constipation, jaundice, and even mental illness. Again, this practice was based on the prevailing medical theories of the time, but it often led to dehydration, malnutrition, and even death. Once again, patients were powerless to refuse these treatments, and physicians were not held responsible for the harm they caused. It was based on the belief that an imbalance of the four humors, which were thought to be the essential elements that made up the body, could cause illness. However, this practice often resulted in patients becoming severely anemic and their conditions worsening. Despite this, patients were not allowed to refuse bloodletting, and physicians were not held accountable for the negative consequences of this practice. They too were expected to submit to the judgment of medical professionals whose knowledge and practices were often far from sound, or given adult doses of toxic substances that could cause permanent damage or death. Also meant that patients could not seek redress for the harm they suffered at the hands of medical professionals. In a legal system that was heavily influenced by religious authorities, patients who were injured or abused by physicians had little recourse and were often left to suffer in silence. This lack of accountability allowed for the perpetuation of harmful and ineffective medical practices, which in turn caused unnecessary pain and suffering for countless individuals, largely due to the prevailing belief that illness was a punishment from God. This meant that there was little accountability for the actions of physicians, and they were free to experiment with new treatments, sometimes with disastrous results. The lack of regulation in the medical profession meant that anyone who wanted to practice medicine could do so without any formal training or licensing. This led to a proliferation of quacks and charlatans who preyed on the sick and desperate, offering false cures or making claims that could not be substantiated. And because the prevailing medical theories were often based on superstition and religious beliefs rather than empirical evidence, patients were frequently subjected to treatments that were not only ineffective but harmful. Parents had little choice but to submit their children to whatever treatment the physician recommended, as refusing medical care was often seen as both legally and morally irresponsible. This meant that children were effectively denied the right to make decisions about their own bodies, or even to express their pain and suffering. The patient's opinion was not merely irrelevant. It was considered potentially dangerous, as questioning medical authority was tantamount to questioning God's will. Not only were they denied basic medical rights, but they also lacked access to decent health care. Monasteries and almshouses often provided the only available medical treatment, and these institutions were typically understaffed and ill-equipped to deal with the sick and injured. As a result, the poor were more likely to receive inappropriate or ineffective treatment, and their conditions often worsened as a result. Moreover, they had little recourse against the medical practices that were often employed, which included a combination of religious rituals, herbal remedies, and bloodletting, none of which were very effective in treating serious illnesses. After all, illness was widely believed to be either divine punishment or a test of faith, and the physician was seen as God's instrument for delivering either cure or righteous suffering. This paternalistic approach extended to every aspect of medical care. The treatment prescribed might involve being chained in a monastery cell, subjected to exorcism rituals involving hours of prayer, fasting, and physical restraint. The patient, often the most vulnerable member of society, had no voice in this process. They had no right to question the treatment or the length of their confinement, and certainly no legal recourse if the cure proved worse than the ailment. Such was the chilling reality of medical care during those dark times. One question arises: did medieval peasants have any rights? Drill holes in a skull or remove internal organs based entirely on his own judgment, often influenced by astrological charts or religious beliefs rather than medical evidence. The patient's role was simply to endure whatever treatment was deemed necessary, regardless of their own wishes or concerns about the procedure. Women faced even more severe violations of what we would now consider basic human dignity. Medieval medical texts routinely described treatments for women that were based on the assumption that they were naturally inferior and prone to hysteria. One particularly disturbing example was the wandering womb theory, which suggested that women's psychological and physical ailments were caused by their uterus literally moving around inside their body. This belief led to treatments that were both absurd and traumatic. Women might be subjected to strong-smelling substances applied to their genitals to lure the womb back to its proper position, or have weights tied to their bodies to prevent the organ from wandering. In an era when medical practices veered between the bizarre and the brutal, did the common folk have any recourse against the whims of physicians or the dictates of religious authorities? The answer, unfortunately, is an absolute and resounding no. Picture, if you will, a peasant suffering from what we would now recognize as depression or anxiety. Fast forward to the present day, and the very notion of medical consent seems so fundamental to the doctor-patient relationship. Surgical procedures, no matter how invasive or experimental, were performed without explanation to the patient. A surgeon might decide to amputate a limb. Children were also denied the basic rights and protections afforded to adults in medieval society. The poor, who made up the majority of medieval society, were especially vulnerable to these abuses. Women, children, and the poor were basically at the mercy of a medical system that had no regard for their rights or dignity. In fact, medieval physicians enjoyed a great deal of leeway in their field. To make matters worse, there was no mechanism in place to compensate patients who were injured as a result of medical malpractice. For example, during the Middle Ages, bloodletting was widely practiced as a treatment for a variety of ailments, including fever, infection, and mental illness. Another common medieval medical practice was the use of purgatives. The absence of medical consent in medieval society, in conclusion, medieval. Abusive dynamics under feudal law. In the rigid hierarchy of feudal law, peasants and serfs were legally and economically bound to their lords. They had no independent legal standing and were treated as property. Doctors, surgeons, and apothecaries rarely questioned the decisions of their wealthy patrons. And when they did offer their opinions, they were more likely to consider the economic implications of various treatments than the humanity of their patients. Physicians knew that they risked angering powerful patrons if they suggested treatments that were too expensive or time-consuming, so they often went along with whatever the lord decided. That meant that sometimes medical treatment was not about curing illness, but about protecting the lord's investment in his property. The absence of consequences for medical errors or intentional misconduct encouraged recklessness and negligence, where they can try out new procedures without informed consent, and where there's no way to hold them responsible for mistakes. A system where power and privilege protected medical practitioners from the consequences of their actions. It was a terrifying situation for anyone seeking medical help. For instance, the use of mercury to treat syphilis could result in severe side effects like hair loss, tremors, and even death. Jews, Muslims, and other religious minorities often avoided seeking medical help from Christian physicians for fear of being subjected to forced conversion attempts. Women who sought help for reproductive health issues ran the risk of being labeled as witches or morally corrupt, especially if their conditions were related to sexuality or childbirth complications. In the 16th century, a woman named Margaret Thatch was driven insane after being treated for syphilis with large amounts of mercury. In a climate of fear and ignorance, Progress in medicine was impossible. The medical establishment failed to learn from experience, experiment with new treatments, or collaborate with colleagues. Without the freedom to explore new ideas and improve existing practices, medieval medicine stagnated for centuries. For their actions and where their economic status granted them immense power over their patients. The medieval emphasis on secrecy and paternalism contributed to the persistent stigma surrounding many medical conditions. Bloodletting, for example, remained a popular practice for centuries despite its ineffectiveness and the harm it caused. Similarly, the use of mercury to treat syphilis continued despite its toxic side effects. The fear of medical error and the lack of consequences for ineffective or harmful treatments meant that patients were often subjected to unnecessary and dangerous interventions, especially those related to sexuality, mental health, and addiction. The deference to authority figures and the suppression of dissenting opinions, stifling intellectual inquiry and the exchange of ideas. This climate of fear and obedience contributed to the rise of absolute monarchies and the suppression of democratic ideals. The acceptance of social hierarchy and the subjugation of certain groups like peasants, serfs, and minorities not only perpetuated inequality, but also provided the foundation for oppressive social structures that persisted for centuries. This stigma often prevents individuals from seeking help and perpetuates harmful stereotypes and misinformation. The necessity of accountability and the value of patient autonomy. It compels us to reflect on the evolution of our healthcare system and the ongoing need to protect against the abuses of power and prejudice within the medical profession. Furthermore, the medieval focus on individual treatment rather than public health measures left communities vulnerable to outbreaks of infectious diseases. The lack of preventive care and the persecution of those with contagious illnesses led to the spread of diseases like leprosy, the Black Death, and tuberculosis, causing widespread suffering and death. Many people still harbor deep-seated fears and prejudices against medical professionals. By treating people as passive recipients of medical intervention rather than active participants in their own healing. When patients could not question treatments or report adverse effects without fear of retribution, physicians received little feedback about the actual effectiveness of their interventions. This created a closed system where harmful practices could persist for centuries without being challenged or improved. Medieval medicine failed to develop many of the psychological and social support systems that we now know are crucial for recovery. Patients who were denied agency in their treatment often experienced depression, anxiety, and learned helplessness that complicated their physical healing and prolonged their suffering, which can be a significant barrier to seeking timely and effective health care. Overcoming this legacy requires addressing systemic issues like discrimination. Without a system to collect and analyze data on the effectiveness of various treatments, medieval medicine lacked the foundation for evidence-based practice. This meant that treatments were often based on superstition, personal beliefs, and anecdotal evidence rather than on systematic observation and testing. As a result, progress in understanding the causes of diseases and developing effective treatments was slow and haphazard. This created a system where healing was inseparable from moral judgment and social conformity. The prospect of being judged, harassed, or even tortured for one's illness or the supposed cure was too horrifying to contemplate. This widespread reluctance to seek medical attention meant that many illnesses went undiagnosed and untreated, leading to needless suffering and death. Diseases like tuberculosis and the plague were allowed to spread unchecked, causing widespread devastation. Physicians saw themselves not just as healers of physical ailments, but as enforcers of social order and religious orthodoxy. A patient who questioned treatment might find themselves accused of heresy or moral corruption, facing punishment that extended far beyond their original medical complaint. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting physicians. Several women were accused of witchcraft after seeking medical help for their health problems. These women were not only dealing with physical ailments, but were also confronting a medical establishment that viewed them with suspicion and prejudice. Their stories highlight the intersection of fear, gender discrimination, and religious intolerance in shaping the medical experiences of marginalized individuals. Similarly, bloodletting, a common medieval practice to treat various ailments by draining the body of blood, often left patients weaker and more susceptible to infections. The fear surrounding bloodletting was so intense that people started to view it as a punishment rather than a cure. Without the fear of repercussions, some doctors might have been tempted to cut corners, prescribe inappropriate treatments, or even conduct harmful experiments. There was no incentive for them to stay updated on the latest medical knowledge or to improve their skills. People lived in constant dread, not only of disease and pain, but of the possible cures. Rumors spread of patients who suffered more from their treatments than from their illnesses, adding to the apprehension and suspicion surrounding medical care. After all, there was no penalty for ignorance or incompetence. This lack of accountability turned every patient into a potential victim of medical abuse. It was less about healing a human being and more about maintaining an asset to generate wealth. This meant that medical decisions were not made by patients or their families, where your life is only worth saving if it's profitable. That's the kind of chilling reality that peasants and serfs had to endure under feudalism. No peer review and no legal consequences for causing harm. If a treatment resulted in a patient's death or permanent disability, it was typically shrugged at as one of the risks of practicing medicine, or the advanced stage of their disease were almost always considered to be the cause of poor results. This lack of accountability created an environment where medical practitioners could experiment freely on human subjects without any fear of repercussions. A lord might allow his serf to seek treatment if it was deemed cost-effective or necessary to maintain a productive workforce. But refusing treatment was seen as a godsend opportunity to save money, not an inhumane action that could lead to death. Conversely, if a peasant was a particularly valuable worker, maybe because he was a skilled craftsman or a strong farmhand, his lord might insist on costly medical procedures to keep him alive. In this way, the value of a human life was measured primarily in economic terms, not in terms of individual worth. The price of saving a life became a simple equation: cost of treatment versus the value of the person as labor. Imagine living in a world where your right to health care depended on your economic value to the ruling class. Under the medieval system, physicians faced no systematic oversight. It was a system where the doctor could do no wrong, and the patient could do no better than to trust and comply. Imagine a world where doctors aren't punished for killing patients. The combination of feudal power dynamics and a lack of accountability created a pervasive culture of fear around medical treatment. It wasn't uncommon for people to believe that cures were often worse than the diseases themselves. This climate of fear was especially acute among marginalized groups who were already vulnerable to persecution. For example, during the Salem witch trials in the late 17th century, in such an atmosphere of fear, people often chose to suffer in silence rather than seek medical care. The consequences of this approach to medical care extended far beyond individual patient experiences. Moreover, the authoritarian structure of medieval medicine stifled innovation and critical thinking that might have led to genuine medical advances. The absence of accountability also hindered the accumulation of medical knowledge. The absence of accountability in medieval medicine also contributed to the persistence of harmful and ineffective treatments. The consequences of this system extended beyond the realm of medicine and had profound implications for the social, cultural, and political landscape of medieval Europe. And that is why the abuses of medieval medicine serves as a stark reminder of the importance of medical ethics. The dark legacy of medical torture When healing became a nightmare, what if the pursuit of healing became a sentence to unimaginable horrors? Welcome to our channel, where today we unravel the chilling tale of medical practices that turn the quest for health into a nightmare. Medical history, a descent into barbarism. Our story begins in medieval Europe, where the medical landscape was dominated by a system rooted in tradition and steeped in religious dogma. Surgeons began to play a pivotal role in the fight against infections, particularly gangrenous wounds, which were prevalent among soldiers. They pioneered techniques to combat sepsis even today. We can see echoes of this paternalistic approach in medical systems that prioritize physician convenience over patient autonomy, or that fail to adequately inform patients about treatment risks and alternatives. Imagine being subjected to having your veins sliced open with unwashed knives, or having poisonous substances coursing through your body. Let's delve into the heart of this unsettling period and expose the chilling truth behind medieval medical practices. Imagine having a limb amputated or being cut open without any pain relief. It was a fate worse than death for many, meaning that wounds could become infected and lead to further complications. The study of anatomy, which is fundamental to understanding the human body, was practically non-existent. Medieval medicine saw the rise of the barber surgeon, an individual who combined surgery with his trade. There were no regulations, no oversight, and certainly no repercussions for botched surgeries or harmful treatments. It was a system that put profit and prestige before patient well-being, leading to gross abuse and horrifying outcomes, turning your skin a sickly shade of gray and making you shake uncontrollably. This wasn't a scene from a dystopian novel, but a grim reality in medieval medicine, where lead and mercury were touted as miracle cures. There was another alarming practice that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, infecting patients with malaria. This bizarre therapy stemmed from the misguided belief that diseases could cure other diseases. This involved withdrawing blood from patients to balance their humors. While the intention might have been to heal, the execution was often disastrous, where the instruments are unwashed and the surgeon's hands are covered in blood. Patients were not asked whether they wanted to undergo a procedure or given information about the risks involved. This lack of consideration for the patient as autonomy led to unnecessary procedures and treatments. We uncover a disturbing tale of ignorance, abuse, and horrifying procedures. It is crucial to acknowledge and understand the mistakes of the past to ensure that they are not repeated in the future. The need for medical accountability and the paramount importance of patient autonomy and well-being. Striving for a future where medical practices are rooted in science serve as a stark reminder of the lengths to which medical science can go astray, leading to the perpetuation of harmful and often deadly medical practices. Each practice reflects a deep-seated misunderstanding of the human body and its ailments, meaning that if a treatment went wrong or a patient died, knowing that there would be no consequences for the harm they inflicted. Such a system not only led to gross negligence, but also hindered the advancement of medical knowledge. Excessive blood withdrawal could lead to severe anemia, weakness, and in many cases, death. Yet despite its potentially fatal consequences, their echoes can still be found in certain corners of modern medicine, where traditional beliefs and rituals persist despite overwhelming evidence of their ineffectiveness. Moreover, the medieval period saw the rise of a rigid social hierarchy in medicine. The barber surgeons, often looked down upon by the physician class, which in turn led to a lack of accountability and a proliferation of quacks, demonstrating the lengths to which physicians went to maintain the balance of humors. The rationale was that the malarial fever could help flush out impurities in the body, but this meant knowingly exposing patients to the deadly parasite that causes malaria. Once infected, patients would experience periodic fevers, chills, and sweats, all while enduring the high mortality rate associated with the disease. It was a dangerous gamble, and one that many did not survive. These individuals, typically untrained, combined surgery with their barbering duties. This meant that the prevailing knowledge of anatomy was often incorrect or incomplete. For example, the belief that the heart was located in the center of the chest, the lack of anatomical knowledge, also contributed to the rampant spread of disease. This led to a situation where the tools used for shaving were often used for surgery. Barber surgeons were motivated more by financial gain than patient care, and their operations were as much a source of income as a means of healing. This resulted in inflated prices for patients and a lack of concern for post-operative care, leaving many to die from treatable conditions. Lead, often consumed in the form of lead acetate, promised to treat everything from diarrhea to syphilis. Symptoms included abdominal pain, neurological issues, and a characteristic gray discoloration of the skin. But this practice led to mercury poisoning, causing tremors, hair loss, and severe damage to the nervous system. In both cases, the treatments were not only useless but highly dangerous, leaving patients with lifelong health issues and disfigurement. They used rusty instruments, leaving patients with infected wounds, and their treatments were more focused on aesthetics than health. Moreover, the goal of surgery was not necessarily to heal, but to balance the humors. So operations were as arbitrary as they were painful. We gain a deeper appreciation for the hard-won rights and protections that modern patients enjoy the principles of informed consent. Proponents of this theory, largely physicians, believed that the human body was governed by 4 essential elements: blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile. Physicians resorted to administering purgatives to flush out corrupt humors from the digestive system. These substances, often mercury or lead compounds, were not only extremely toxic, but also highly dangerous to administer. This might sound incomprehensible, but the idea was that the malarial fever would somehow purify the body. This meant deliberately exposing patients to mosquitoes carrying the deadly disease, knowingly condemning them to a life of chills, fevers, and potential death. It was a gamble with life itself, and one that many did not survive. Imagine swallowing a substance that would burn your insides and cause tremors, madness, and a slow, agonizing death. That was the reality of medieval medicine. Bloodletting, a common practice, involved draining the body of blood, often excessively, leaving patients weak and susceptible to further ailments. Purging, on the other hand, forced patients to expel their guts, subjecting them to excruciating pain and potential organ damage. And then there were potions, mixtures of herbs, and sometimes toxic substances, which were supposed to cure illnesses but often left patients worse off. That emerged only after centuries of struggle against the authoritarian medical traditions established in medieval times. But fundamental shifts in our understanding of human dignity and the relationship between healers and those they serve. The medieval approach to medical care serves as a stark reminder of what happens when healing becomes divorced from compassion, when authority replaces empathy, and when the powerful are allowed to treat the vulnerable as mere objects for their intervention rather than as human beings deserving of respect, and paved the way for the acceptance of antiseptic methods introduced by Lister in the mid-19th century. Despite these advancements, the surgeon's status remained lower than that of physicians. It was until the late 19th century, with the rise of specialists such as neurologists and ophthalmologists, the teachings of ancient Greek and Roman authorities were revered and challenged the emerging field of anatomy and surgery. As physicians primarily focused on treating the balance of humors in the body, this neglect of surgical advancements allowed a different group, barber surgeons, to take the surgical field. These individuals, whose training was often informal and empirical rather than theoretical, quickly gained notoriety for their ability to perform surgeries like wound treatment. They were looked down upon by the physician class, who considered them inferior due to their lack of formal education and their association with low-status occupations. This stark contrast in societal perception led to a fractured medical community, each group resistant to acknowledging the other's expertise. However, the dark legacy of medieval medicine continued long into the modern era. Surgeons, though more adept at physical interventions, were not immune to the influence of humoral theory. This meant that surgeries were performed without anesthesia, while physicians were making life miserable through their extreme therapies. The lack of anatomical knowledge was staggering. In this dark medical landscape, there was no concept of medical accountability. Physicians and surgeons were not answerable for their actions. Imagine being given a remedy that not only fails to cure you, but slowly poisons you. But the use of lead and mercury was not the only instance where medieval medicine meddled with dangerous substances. Adding to the horrors of medieval medicine was the complete absence of medical accountability. Doctors were not answerable for their actions. They're about to get much worse, because here are the top 10 worst things that could happen to you in medieval medicine. In our last episode, we covered the appalling realities of being a medieval peasant. And while life in those days sucked for everyone, there was at least some small comfort in knowing that if you got sick, a doctor wouldn't make things worse. But let's face it, that's not always true today. Physicians were paid more for dramatic interventions than for simple remedies or preventive care. This led to a medical culture that favored spectacular but useless treatments over humble but effective ones. A physician who prescribed rest and good nutrition earned far less than one who performed bloodletting, administered exotic potions, or conducted surgical procedures. Operating theaters were filthy chambers where multiple patients might be treated with the same unwashed tools, spreading disease and contamination. Many physicians privately questioned the effectiveness of their treatments, but were trapped by the rigid dogma of medical orthodoxy. For example, women in labor had it especially rough. The leading cause of death for women during childbirth was hemorrhage. Yet doctors continued to prescribe treatments that caused dangerous contractions, performed unnecessary interventions that increased bleeding. They were widely accepted and encouraged by mainstream medical authorities. Procedures were performed blindly, and anatomical knowledge was often inaccurate or incomplete. However, there was a big problem with this rote learning approach. Treatments were often based on inaccurate or incomplete understanding of the human body. For example, physicians believed that the brain was a humor. This meant that students spent most of their time memorizing information instead of actually learning practical skills. They were not required to do dissections or internships, and they certainly weren't trained in hygiene or sanitation. Check out our series on the Black Death, or if you want something totally different, check out our series on ancient Rome. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes every week. As a result, most medieval physicians were not prepared to deal with real-world medical problems. They were not familiar with actual anatomy, and they had little understanding of how to treat illnesses or injuries. This created a situation where many doctors were more like pharmacists than general practitioners. They were able to prescribe remedies for certain conditions, but they were not equipped to deal with anything more complex, which meant that they tried to balance it by inducing vomiting, diarrhea, or sweating. The medieval medical establishment was very gatekeepy. Doctors saw themselves as an elite class, and they looked down on anyone who practiced medicine without a degree. This meant that many people were denied access to health care, and those who did seek out medical attention were often turned away or given ineffective treatment. The restrictive education system limited the pool of available healers, and the elitist attitude of the medical establishment prevented them from working together. The result was a healthcare system that failed its patients. They also believed that diseases were caused by an imbalance of the four humors, which led to ineffective or even harmful treatments. The lack of scientific thinking in medieval medicine resulted in a lot of pain and suffering for patients. First, much of the information was simply wrong. To practice medicine in medieval Europe, you needed a university degree. However, this doesn't mean that medieval doctors were qualified or competent. The education system was highly flawed, leading to disastrous results. For example, medieval texts described the human body as having 3, not 2, stomachs. They also believed that the heart had teeth, which could crack walnuts, and that the brain was a sponge-like organ that absorbed moisture from the air. Second, students were not required to actually test the accuracy of what they learned. In fact, they were often encouraged to accept ancient texts as absolute truth without questioning them. This created a situation where misinformation and superstition were indistinguishable from medical knowledge. Students learned and repeated a lot of nonsense, and they passed on this faulty information to their patients. For example, physicians believed that the liver was responsible for producing urine, despite the fact that it has no connection to the urinary system. They also believed that the spleen produced semen, which led to bizarre treatments for infertility, such as sewing up the spleen to make it larger. The result was a generation of healers who were not only ignorant, but also actively harmful. From the 13th century onwards, the writings of Galen and Avicenna were considered the definitive guides to medicine in Europe. Despite the fact that they were often based on flawed logic, Galen's theories remained largely unquestioned for centuries, in part because they were backed by the Roman Catholic Church. The Church saw human dissection as a sin, believing that it violated the sanctity of the human body. As a result, medieval anatomists were forced to rely on animal dissections and cadavers from time to time, which meant they rarely had access to fresh specimens, or used instruments that caused internal injuries. The maternal mortality rate was appallingly high, yet physicians blamed the deaths on the inherent weakness of women rather than examining their own practices. Instead of helping bring new life into the world, medieval doctors were often responsible for ending the lives of mothers and babies alike. Those who dared to suggest alternative approaches faced persecution from medical authorities and religious leaders. The few who attempted to observe and document actual results were dismissed as heretics challenging divine wisdom. That means that if you went to a medieval doctor, you may have received treatment that was based on outdated, inaccurate, or simply made-up theories. You could be subjected to painful and dangerous procedures that had no real benefit and might even make you worse. It was a medical free-for-all, and no one was keeping things clean. So imagine how doubly bad it must have been back then. There was also a perverse incentive for doctors to make illnesses seem more severe and chronic than they actually were. After all, a long-term patient meant a steady income stream. Physicians attributed madness to demonic possession, hormonal imbalances, or moral failings. Treatments included exorcism, violent purging, physical restraints, and isolation in conditions that would drive any sane person to madness. Patients with mental health conditions were often subjected to the most brutal treatments, as their inability to advocate for themselves made them perfect victims for medical experimentation. It was a time when science and superstition collided to create a terrifying hellscape for those seeking help. So instead of focusing on cures, medieval physicians often kept patients ill so they could continue making money off of them. As it turns out, the training of medieval physicians was equally appalling. Medical education was based entirely on ancient texts that were often mistranslated or misunderstood. Students never observed actual human anatomy, instead learning from books, filled with anatomical errors and fantastical theories like the Four Humors. When they did encounter real patients, they applied these flawed teachings with deadly confidence. The result was a generation of healers who were not only incompetent, but actively harmful. But wait, it gets worse because the economic incentives of medieval medicine created a system that prioritized elaborate, expensive procedures over effective care. This is partly why the most common medieval treatment was bloodletting. It was cheap, easy to perform, and had the added benefit of being completely useless. If you think this sounds cynical, you ain't heard nothing yet. The next layer of the onion involves the tools of the trade, or rather, the instruments of torture. Medieval surgical knives were often dull and dirty, meaning incisions were slow and painful. Bone saws were crude and imprecise, often sawing through the wrong bones or leaving fragments embedded in the patient's body. Cauterizing irons were heated to extreme temperatures that caused excruciating pain and burned away healthy tissue along with the bad. And that's not even mentioning the rectal dilators, which were used to, you guessed it, dilate the rectum. But these instruments weren't just rusty and unhygienic. They were also incredibly unreliable. Surgical tools in the Middle Ages were basically designed to maim, not heal. And a lack of proper sterilization meant that every instrument was a potential source of deadly infection. But the worst part was that the same tools were used for everything from small procedures to amputations. And it wasn't just patients who suffered. Doctors also bore the brunt of medieval medical practices. But that's just scratching the surface because there were certain groups who faced even greater horrors. Similarly, mental illness was perhaps the most misunderstood condition in medieval medicine. What's perhaps most disturbing is that these practices were not confined to obscure texts or fringe practitioners. The effects were disastrous. Medieval medical students were taught to memorize a massive amount of information about anatomy, physiology, and pathology. It was a recipe for disaster. However, there was a bright side. At least medieval physicians were well trained. There were no witch doctors allowed. You see, the curriculum focused almost entirely on theoretical knowledge. But here's the kicker. Want to learn more about medieval medicine? Part 5 of 12, The Merchants of Misery, Medical Commerce and Exploitation. The acrid smoke of burning herbs drifted through the narrow streets of London as Master Aldrich the apothecary arranged his wares in the flickering candlelight. Glass vials filled with murky liquids lined his shelves, each promising miraculous cures for ailments both real and imagined. Medicine transformed from a charitable calling into a lucrative business, peddling dubious remedies in exchange for substantial profits. We must confront the disturbing reality that the mistreatment of patients was not an accident or the result of primitive conditions alone. We will delve into the horrifying world of medieval surgery where operations were performed without anesthesia, basic hygiene, and often with the patient still conscious. The operating theater became a place of public entertainment as surgeons experimented with new techniques on live patients, subjecting them to excruciating pain and grotesque procedures. Join us as we explore the extremes of medieval surgical practices, the ethical boundaries that were crossed, and the innovations that ultimately led to the development of modern surgical techniques, despite the unimaginable suffering inflicted on countless individuals. It was the inevitable outcome of a medical system built on false theories. We urge you to subscribe and become an integral part of our community. By subscribing, you will ensure that you never miss an installment of our series, allowing you to continue exploring these gripping narratives. As always, thank you for joining us on this enlightening and thought-provoking journey. We look forward to having you back for part 6 and for many more installments to come. Together, let us continue to unravel the intricate tapestry of history and shed light on the often overlooked aspects of our past. Your presence is invaluable to us, and we eagerly anticipate sharing more captivating stories with you in the future. Until then, take care and stay curious. Social hierarchies and economic incentives that rewarded spectacle over healing. Remember, your engagement is our inspiration. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and together let's continue to discover the boundless wonders of knowledge. The physicians of the medieval era were not simply ignorant. They were participants in a system of institutionalized medical violence that prioritized authority and profit over human welfare. This dark chapter in medical history serves as a stark reminder of what happens when medical practice becomes divorced from empirical observation, when social hierarchies override human compassion, and when economic interests triumph over patient welfare. Unlike the physician whose knowledge was shrouded in mystery, the apothecary's shop was a place of supposed transparency, displaying its wares openly for all to see. However, the truth was far from being revealed. Behind the facade of the open market, the apothecary operated with the same disregard for ethics that plagued the medical profession as a whole. They compounded their illicit profits by diluting or adulterating their products, selling fake or low-quality remedies as genuine cures. While the unsuspecting public remained none the wiser, the apothecary pocketed significant margins on each sale, lining his coffers with the fees paid by desperate patients seeking relief from their ailments. To further bolster their income, apothecaries engaged in the nefarious practice of prescribing their own wares, dispensing medicines they themselves stocked in order to guarantee a consistent flow of revenue. This created a conflict of interest of the highest order, as the apothecary was incentivized to prescribe medications regardless of their actual efficacy, ensuring that customers were continually forced to return for additional doses, thus perpetuating a cycle of unnecessary purchases. By controlling both the supply and distribution of medical treatments, apothecaries wove a web of exploitation, profiting from the very ailments they claimed to alleviate. This system of medical commerce was not merely an aberration or the result of limited understanding. It was the inevitable outcome of a medical system built on false theories, social hierarchies, and economic incentives that rewarded spectacle over healing. The emergence of guilds gave certain practitioners monopolistic control over medical practice, allowing them to manipulate prices and eliminate competition. Meanwhile, the absence of any meaningful regulation meant that anyone could claim to be a healer, regardless of their qualifications or intentions. At the apex of this medical hierarchy stood the university-trained physicians, men who wielded their education like a weapon against the ignorant masses. These learned doctors commanded astronomical fees for their services, often charging the equivalent of several months' wages for a single consultation. They dressed in elaborate robes and spoke in Latin, not to demonstrate their knowledge, but to mystify and intimidate patients who dared question their authority. Master Bartholomew was one such physician, a graduate of the University of Salerno who had built his reputation on theatrical diagnosis and expensive treatments. When summoned to attend a wealthy merchant's daughter suffering from fever, he would arrive with great ceremony, examining the patient's urine in ornate glass vessels while muttering learned phrases in Latin. His prescription would invariably involve rare and costly ingredients: powdered unicorn horn from the distant Orient, mercury imported from Spain, or exotic herbs that could only be obtained through his own carefully controlled network of suppliers. The patient's recovery or death mattered little to Master Bartholomew's reputation. If she recovered, it was proof of his superior skill and learning. If she died, it was clearly because the family had waited too long to seek his expertise, or perhaps they had failed to follow his precise instructions. The physician's position was unassailable, protected by the mystique of university learning and the desperate hope of suffering families. But the exploitation extended far beyond simple overcharging. Medieval physicians developed elaborate systems of artificial illness, concocting bogus diagnoses and prognoses to ensure a steady stream of income. One common ruse involved inducing vomiting and diarrhea in a patient, thereby prolonging their illness and increasing the physician's fees. Meanwhile, the patient, stripped of their dignity, endured endless cycles of purging and confinement, their body ravaged by dehydration and malnutrition. Other physicians specialized in creating artificial abscesses, inflaming healthy tissue until it turned into a painful boil, which they would then treat with poultices and ointments, milking the patient for every penny. And when all else failed, there was always the mysterious resistible, a catch-all diagnosis for any ailment that baffled the physician, guaranteeing that the expensive treatments would continue indefinitely. But behind the ornate labels and exotic ingredients lay a darker truth. Medieval medicine had become a ruthless marketplace, where human suffering was transformed into profit and desperate patients became prey for unscrupulous practitioners. In the shadowy world of medieval medical commerce, the line between healer and charlatan blurred beyond recognition. Physicians, apothecaries, barber, surgeons, and traveling quacks all competed in a brutal economy where the currency was pain and the merchandise was hope. This was not the noble art of healing that modern medicine aspires to be, but rather a predatory system that exploited the most vulnerable members of society with calculated precision. The rise of medical commerce in medieval Europe created a perfect storm of exploitation as cities grew and trade flourished. Amidst this landscape of medical malfeasance, the apothecary emerged as the merchant of misery. As we continue our exploration of the darkest chapters in medical history, in Part 6, titled Surgical Shocks, Torture and Innovation in the Operating Theater. Meanwhile, if you find yourself captivated by this captivating journey through time, and now, dear viewer, we invite you to embark on another enlightening adventure by clicking on the video presented on your screen. The year is 1485. You are a merchant in Florence, Italy, and quacks used every trick imaginable to create artificial scarcities and maximize their profits. Or that particular herbs lost their potency if not harvested by virgin maidens at dawn. You rush back to the doctor's office, hopeful for a positive outcome, are filled with accounts of soldiers enduring horrendous treatments rather than facing the grim reality of dying alone on the battlefield. It seems like the lesser of two evils, each labeled with an ornate wax seal, is the terrifying tale of how a small bump on your finger could lead you to utter ruin in medieval Europe. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been taken advantage of by a medical professional? Or perhaps you have a friend who has experienced something similar? Share your stories below. Also, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to show support for my work. Thanks for watching. The pain under your finger has become your new reality, and there is no cure. The doctors, apothecaries, and quacks have only prolonged your torment for their own gain, gradually consuming your thoughts and dominating your waking hours. Before you are driven back to the dark recesses of your subconscious where the monster under your finger lives. Unable to work, you are forced to sell your house and belongings to pay for more treatments. The apothecary himself is an imposing figure. Behind the counter, the apothecary listens intently to his customers, nodding sagely and offering words of comfort and encouragement. Some customers leave after receiving advice or purchasing a small selection of herbs and tinctures, eager to absorb the apothecary's vast knowledge, while others consult him on health issues ranging from the common cold to more serious ailments, while the liquid in the vial is merely water with a few drops of alcohol. Though Master Aldrich may not be intentionally deceiving you, his methods are shrouded in secrecy, and customers often do not know the exact contents of the remedies they are buying, which allows him to sell his wares to an unsuspecting public. He reaches behind the counter and pulls out a selection of herbs and spices. Their pungent aroma fills the shop as he expertly combines them in a mortar and pestle, grinding them into a fine powder. The apothecary then places the finished product into a small leather pouch and hands it to you, along with a tightly sealed glass vial. He warns you to keep the vial under your pillow while you sleep and to consume the contents the following morning. You leave the shop feeling a renewed sense of hope and determination to heal. His shelves are stocked with an array of intriguing ingredients, from exotic spices to strangely shaped glass vials filled with mysterious liquids. However, the apothecary knows that his true profit lies not in the sale of these items, but in the careful cultivation of his reputation. He has spent years cultivating an air of mystery and wisdom around his person, leading many of his patrons to believe that he possesses knowledge beyond that of ordinary men. Some lying in filthy straw beds, others huddled in corners. The medical staff quickly applies leeches to drain her of bad humors. Similarly, the diaries of Italian physician Francesco Ravazzani provide harrowing tales of patients enduring excruciating bloodletting procedures and other abusive medical practices simply to avoid the isolation of a lonely death. These stories highlight the desperate lengths to which people would go to avoid the fear of dying alone, a terror so primal that it often outweighed the suffering inflicted by the most brutal medical practices. If you choose to stay in the hospice, you will become embroiled in the exploitative practices of the medical establishment, including bloodletting, leeching, and other harmful treatments designed to prolong your illness and line the pockets of the medical elite, each more painful and degrading than the last. Bloodletting, leeching, blistering, purging, and enemas become your daily routine. All the while, your body grows weaker and your mind more disoriented. Finally, after weeks of torment, you are ready for the major cure. When the doctor arrives, you offer up your arm for the life-saving procedure, only to have him insert a sharp needle into your vein and draw out a few drops of blood. He then replaces the blood with a milky liquid and sends you away with a vial of the same substance to rub on your finger. On the other hand, choosing to go home means facing the risk of dying alone without medical intervention. For many people in this time period, the fear of dying alone, a fate commonly known as the king's death, was so overwhelming that they would endure the worst abuses of medical commerce simply to avoid it. Indeed, stories of patients choosing to stay in exploitative medical environments solely to escape the prospect of dying alone were commonplace in medieval Europe. Dozens of people, their bodies riddled with wounds and sores, are lined up outside the doctor's door. Each case is more dire than the last, from a young boy covered in boils to an emaciated woman with a gaping chest wound. The doctor greets you warmly, but explains that there is bad news. The lunar alignment has shifted again, pushing back the start of your treatment, or stay in a local hospice while you undergo a series of preliminary treatments to prepare your body for the upcoming cure, likely due to the depletion of your nervous system from mercury poisoning caused by the doctor's initial treatment. Despite your troubled state, you make a decision that will have profound consequences for your future. If these fabricated restrictions served no medical purpose, but allowed doctors to control supply and demand with surgical precision. The practice of astrology became a particularly insidious tool of medical exploitation, forcing patients to wait weeks or even months while their conditions worsened during this enforced delay. Families would often spend their life savings on preliminary treatments, all prescribed by the same physician who would eventually provide the real cure. A small red bump has appeared on your finger. You dismiss it, assuming it will pass. But within days, the bump grows into a painful wound. As the seeping sore refuses to heal, you seek out a doctor for help. This marks the beginning of a horrifying ordeal, one in which you will spend hundreds of florins, be forced to submit to humiliating public spectacles, and ultimately lose everything before learning the terrifying truth about the bump on your finger. During the Middle Ages, scarcity was the ultimate business strategy. And in the absence of effective medical treatments, savvy physicians, apothecaries, of course, this kind of absurd situation didn't happen all the time, nor did all medical professionals prey on their patients. However, it was common enough to be considered a norm. After several days of futile attempts to treat the wound, you decide to visit a reputable doctor. You have heard good things about him. He holds a doctorate from the University of Bologna. To further complicate matters, he informs you that the lunar cycle is currently unfavorable for treatment. Your only recourse is to drink a vial of mercury diluted in wine and anoint the wound with a salve made from dried toads. While you are dubious about the efficacy of these remedies, you follow the doctor's instructions diligently. You trust his expertise and are desperate for a solution, especially in times of epidemic outbreaks like the bubonic plague, when death stalked the streets and desperation ruled the hearts of men. This is the story of how the bump on your finger became a gateway to hell. After enduring several weeks of agony and spending considerable sums on treatments, you find yourself in a terrible state. As the day of the next treatment finally arrives, you are now suffering from severe insomnia. Now we come to a pivotal moment in our story. For example, the writings of Ambroise Paré, a 16th century French military surgeon. In the end, you decide to stay in the hospice. In the ensuing days, you undergo a series of treatments. Meanwhile, across town in the apothecary's shop, a crowd of customers eagerly awaits their turn to speak with the enigmatic Master Ulrich. When you enter Ulrich's shop, you are immediately struck by its unusual atmosphere. Unlike the cluttered, chaotic shops of other apothecaries, as you approach the counter, the apothecary's eyes meet yours, and a knowing smile spreads across his face. But alas, the apothecary has just sold you a mixture of chalk and powdered glass to relieve your finger pain. Yet despite the apothecary's best efforts, what started as a minor irritation has turned into a living hell, leaving you questioning if the pain will ever end. And that, my friends, imagine a world where sickness is not just unpleasant, but an opportunity to make money. Welcome to the wacky world of 18th century Germany, where we meet our hero, the infamous swindler Cornelius Schwarz. He peddled a special mix of herbs and honey, his secret recipe, of course, but don't be fooled. It tasted great, but it couldn't cure anything except maybe a broken heart. That's because it was full of dangerous stuff like mercury and lead. Forget for a moment the wild world of traveling swindlers and focus on the everyday reality of healthcare back in the day. Imagine this: you're not feeling well, so you go to see a doctor. Why would a doctor recommend a cheap herb if they could prescribe a much more expensive ointment or a lengthy hospital stay? Practitioners believed that illnesses were caused by an imbalance of humors, and they tried to fix it by inflicting more pain. Back then, women were often barred from the medical field because of societal norms and biases. But here's the twist. Many women did practice medicine, even though they did it on the down low. From quacks to barber surgeons, it seems like anyone and everyone was jumping into the healthcare fray. What's your take on this historical health hazard? Share your thoughts below. And while you're at it, remember to subscribe for more fascinating journeys through time. We've got a ton of historical tailies waiting to be explored. Thanks for joining me. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking questions. Midwives, for instance, were highly skilled in assisting with childbirth, but they were often looked down upon by male medical practitioners. Despite this, they saved countless lives with their expertise. However, their contributions were belittled, and they were frequently portrayed as inferior. Male doctors claimed that midwives were unqualified, even though their track record was stellar. The misogyny didn't stop there. Women were also blamed for the high infant mortality rate. Even though most deaths were due to factors like malnutrition and disease, not medical care. Men in the medical field twisted the facts to make women look bad, all while ignoring their own shortcomings. Bloodletting, purging, and blistering were common treatments that often did more harm than good. Men wanted to keep women out to protect their own turf and power. You wouldn't expect these seemingly simpletons to cause a stir in the medical world, but they did. Back in the day, barbers were the OG multitaskers. They gave haircuts, yes, but they also dabbled in bloodletting and other medical procedures. This wasn't some side hustle. They were doing full-on medical work. The thing is, doctors didn't like sharing the spotlight. They saw barbers as interlopers stepping into their territory. Doctors argued that only trained medical professionals should be allowed to practice medicine. Basically, they wanted to keep barbers in their lane, scissors and razors, and out of the pharmacy. Doctors felt threatened by barbers' involvement in medical procedures, fearing that it would diminish their own status and expertise. They accused barbers of practicing medicine without proper training, undermining the years of study that doctors had invested in their craft. This tension between doctors and barbers highlights a broader struggle in medieval society, the battle between tradition and innovation, between established professions and new developments. To put it simply, it was a classic case of boys' club mentality. These practices not only worsened patients' conditions, but also prolonged their illnesses, keeping those profit-making wheels turning. It wasn't uncommon for doctors to recommend multiple treatments at once, inflating the cost and inflating their income, of course. It gets even crazier. Doctors rarely focused on prevention. Healthy individuals weren't very profitable, so there wasn't much incentive to offer advice on diet or lifestyle changes that could prevent illnesses. Instead, they treated illnesses once they struck, milking them for as long as they could. This messed up system turned healthcare into a profit-making venture rather than a service aimed at healing. Patients were seen as walking wallets, and their illnesses became a source of income for practitioners. You lay out your symptoms, and the good doctor listens patiently. Finally, he has a diagnosis and a prescription for you. Sounds straightforward, right? Well, hold on to your medieval helmets because things are about to get real messy. You'd think people would have noticed when they got super sick after drinking it, right? But nope, Cornelius had a brilliant plan. Instead of getting paid for successfully treating a patient, they were paid for each individual treatment, no matter how useless it was. Let me explain. Say you had a persistent cough. A single treatment for that cough might involve multiple visits, each with its own set of medications or procedures. For each visit, the doctor prescribes something different, be it a herbal concoction, a painful bloodletting procedure, or even a good old-fashioned massage. With each of these treatments, the doctor received payment from the patient. Now, imagine that your cough persists. Wouldn't you agree that the doctor is trying to drag things out for as long as possible, not because he genuinely wants to help you, but because it means more treatments and more money for him? Yep, you guessed it. Doctors were incentivized to make illnesses last as long as possible, not to cure them. He'd stay in one place for a few weeks, spreading the word about his amazing cures. People would come to him with their health problems, and he'd sell them his magic potion, promising it would work wonders. But here's the kicker, it didn't. After downing his concoction, people didn't get better. In fact, they usually got worse, really bad sometimes. So what did he do? He had them come back for more, claiming that the first dose hadn't been strong enough. He kept upping the ante, saying that each new illness was because of the last one. So they were stuck in a never-ending cycle of sickness and buying his fake medicine. If anyone questioned his methods or ingredients, he just laughed and moved on to the next town. He travels around the countryside selling his special elixir, which can cure anything from the plague to heartache. And boy, do people want it. His product is so popular that it's always sold out. But here's the catch. The only way to get more is to buy even more, like a never-ending shopping spree. This might sound insane, but it wasn't just Cornelius making this big buck off bad brew. No, sir, this trickery was all too common back in the day. And if you want to know how these traveling swindlers pulled off their cons, and why the whole medical scene was a hot mess, keep watching. Cornelius Schwartz, aka Doan Man of the Dark Arts, was a modern con man, but he didn't sell snake oil. And let me tell you, he wasn't alone. These traveling tricksters used the same old playbook. They'd show up looking all official with fancy clothes and talk a big game about their medical skills. They'd hang out at taverns and spread rumors about how they could cure any ailment. Soon enough, people started talking about their supposed miracles, so they packed up and hit the road again. It was a rinse and repeat, fooling everyone along the way. This pattern continued for years until finally some wise heads started catching on. They realized that these wandering wizards weren't the real deal. They were just cunning swindlers preying on people's hopes and fears. Yet despite this growing awareness, the general population remained largely unaware of the tricks played on them. Now let's shift gears and talk about what really made the medical field in medieval times a complete mess. Back then, the way doctors got paid was downright bizarre. To add insult to injury, they were also incentivized to prescribe the most expensive treatment options available. Think about it. But it wasn't just the economic structure that made medieval medicine a disaster waiting to happen. The medical knowledge of the time was seriously flawed. Now let's talk about the least likely culprits in the medical mayhem. In the end, the distrust of women in medicine wasn't about competence. It was about control. Now let's turn our attention to another group that shook the medical establishment: barbers. Yes, barbers. All in all, the medical practices of the time were a real head-scratcher. The medieval church was an unlikely entrepreneur, yet it built an extensive business empire on the backs of the sick and dying, yet turned a blind eye to the deplorable conditions in which these individuals lived. Rather than offering solace and spiritual guidance to the afflicted, monks exploited their faith and desperation for financial gain. One common practice was charging patients for prayers, sacraments, and pilgrimages, with some monasteries demanding steep prices for the chance to participate in religious ceremonies. They often held multiple positions within religious institutions, granting them considerable influence and access to resources. Supposedly repositories of healing knowledge, these works served primarily to promote expensive treatments and establish the authority of their writers. The language of these texts was often intentionally obscure. This allowed medical practitioners to wield their knowledge as a powerful tool for manipulation and control. By shrouding their practices in complexity and jargon, they effectively limited access to those who could afford the necessary books and tutors. Aspiring physicians were required to purchase expensive books and hire tutors to understand the contents. This created a situation where the pursuit of medical knowledge became a gatekeeping mechanism. Furthermore, these texts were not just tools for medical practice. By filling their works with complex theories and obscure references, they constructed an image of their profession as being highly specialized and beyond the comprehension of the average person. This served to reinforce the notion that medical authority was absolute and unquestionable. Any attempt to challenge these practices was met with a wall of incomprehensible jargon, effectively silencing dissent and ensuring compliance. Spending their life savings on the journey and the various treatments and blessings offered by local clergy, religious figures who once served as beacons of hope and solace now preyed on the vulnerabilities of the sick and dying, leaving many to suffer not just physically, but also spiritually. The temporary improvement that many pilgrims experienced, often due simply to the rest and change of environment, was attributed to divine intervention, thus perpetuating the cycle of religious medical exploitation. The promise of miraculous healing drew huge crowds of pilgrims to these holy sites, creating a thriving pharmaceutical trade around them. Vendors capitalized on the desperation of these individuals, selling blessed medicines, holy water, and pieces of saints' clothing at astronomical prices. The true value of these items was irrelevant. Their supposed spiritual properties justified any price the market would bear. This created a situation where the most vulnerable members of society, it seemed as though God himself was intervening in their lives, solidifying the link between suffering, faith, and exploitation, making it nearly impossible to challenge their methods without challenging God himself. This religious veneer around their medical practices made them practically immune to criticism. If one questioned their methods, one risked accusations of impiety or even heresy. Some became both pastors and physicians, leveraging their religious authority to prescribe treatments and collect payments directly from their parishioners. Others established monasteries near busy trade routes, attracting pilgrims and travelers who sought not only spiritual solace, but also medical expertise. Within these monasteries, they charged fees for basic medical services, positioning themselves as indispensable providers of healthcare in remote areas. To further legitimize their practices, they created elaborate systems of rules and regulations that governed the interactions between themselves and their patients. These rules often included strict confidentiality agreements that prevented patients from revealing the details of their treatments and financial transactions. By controlling the narrative surrounding their medical practices, they effectively silenced any doubts or negative experiences, allowing them to operate with minimal interference. Such exploitation not only took advantage of the faithful, but also corrupted the spiritual purpose of these secret practices. Instead of being places of refuge and healing, monasteries became profit centers that preyed on the vulnerability of the sick and dying. But rather than addressing the root causes of these diseases, it profited from the misery they caused. Religious leaders propagated the notion that illness and pain were punishments for sin, making it difficult for patients to challenge medical authority without also questioning religious doctrine. This religious veneer gave medical practitioners a license to exploit their patients, knowing that questioning their methods could result in accusations of heresy. It was a clever psychological manipulation that put patients in a double bind. They were financially burdened by expensive treatments and faced spiritual persecution if they dared to question the medical establishment. This toxic combination of religion and medicine created an environment of fear and submission, where patients were too afraid to stand up for their rights and seek better care. A prime example of this callousness was the treatment of beggars. These individuals understood the immense power they wielded over their followers and employed it to create lucrative medical empires. At the forefront of this exploitation stood individuals like monks, priests, and friars who held deep religious convictions, but also harbored strong entrepreneurial spirits. They saw an opportunity to capitalize on the widespread belief in the healing power of religion and establish themselves as intermediaries between God and his people. Through their positions of power, they could dictate the terms of engagement with the divine and extract significant financial benefits for themselves. These individuals, reduced to destitution and forced to rely on charity, were seen as a source of income rather than human beings in need of assistance. The church actively encouraged the lay people to give alms to beggars, exempting them from paying taxes, which effectively laundered money for the wealthy. The church not only perpetuated their misery, but also enriched itself at the expense of the very people it claimed to help, all while claiming to serve the divine purpose of healing. As a charitable organization, the church claimed to embody compassion and care for humanity. In reality, it eagerly partnered with avaricious medical practitioners to exploit the vulnerable. They operated hospitals that resembled businesses more than charitable institutions. The primary objective of these monastery hospitals was to generate revenue rather than provide free health care to the sick. The monks readily admitted paying patients and even charged fees for basic care. Wealthy patients seeking exclusive services were directed to these hospitals, where they were charged exorbitant prices for special diets, private rooms, and luxurious accommodations. To maximize profits, the monks skimped on essential supplies and medications, often providing subpar treatment that failed to address the root causes of illness. For instance, they may have given patients placebos or ineffective remedies, leaving many to suffer and prolonging their stays in the hospital. This mercenary approach to healthcare not only deprived the sick of quality treatment, but also enriched the monasteries at the expense of their health and well-being. While officially promoting charity and care for the sick, join us today as we delve into the dark underbelly of medieval medicine and uncover how the hypocrisy was palpable when the church leadership preached about serving the poor and sick. Monasteries, which should have been sanctuaries of faith and compassion, were transformed into profit-making enterprises. Moreover, monasteries became notorious for charging exorbitant fees for religious rituals and treatments. Religious authorities also provided the ideological justification for medical exploitation through their teachings about suffering and divine will. However, there was a significant group of religious figures who recognized the power of combining religious and medical authority and used it to their advantage. These religious entrepreneurs used every tool at their disposal to maintain control and increase their wealth. The most sophisticated medical exploiters understood the power of combining religious and medical authority and positioned themselves as divinely inspired healers. Pilgrimages to holy sites became another avenue for medical exploitation. Medieval medical texts and treatises. Thank you for watching. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at a question that has tormented philosophers since the dawn of man. Are we merely animals, or is there something more? We live in a time when science has unlocked many of the secrets of the human body and mind. In the 13th century, the Franciscan friar Roger Bacon, often considered the father of the scientific method. Scotus was a Franciscan friar and one of the most influential theologians of his day. One such school was the Via Moderna, or the modern way, which emphasized the use of reason and logic to understand the divine. The ideas and debates that had emerged during this era continued to resonate and influence thinkers throughout the Renaissance and the Reformation. We gain a deeper appreciation for the rich tapestry of ideas that have shaped our world, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The pursuit of profit has often been at the forefront of innovation. How can we balance the need for financial success with the ethical obligation to treat all individuals with respect and dignity? Your engagement helps us reach more viewers and spark meaningful conversations that inspire positive change. Together, we can challenge the status quo and push for a brighter future. So don't forget to stay tuned for more insightful episodes that tackle critical social issues and encourage meaningful dialogue. Your participation makes a difference. Let's continue to have these important conversations and work towards a better world. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episode. And how do we hold those in power accountable when their decisions negatively impact vulnerable communities? It's time to confront these uncomfortable truths and demand a better future for all. But what are the ethical boundaries? Where do we draw the line between providing essential services and exploiting vulnerable populations for financial gain? We'll explore real-world examples that blur the line between progress and exploitation. Examine the motivations of those who prioritize profits over people and discuss the potential consequences of unchecked ambition. To seek understanding and wisdom in the face of life's greatest mysteries. The ideas of medieval scholars on the nature of humanity serve as a reminder of the importance of open-minded inquiry, the courage to challenge conventional wisdom, and the pursuit of knowledge for the betterment of humanity. These timeless lessons remain as relevant today as they were in the medieval era, calling us to confront difficult questions, embrace diversity of thought, and strive for a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. The works of Augustine, Bacon, and Scotus, among others, it's easy to overlook the darker side of progress. What happens when the relentless pursuit of profit and advancement overshadows ethical considerations and basic human dignity? Join me as we delve into the unsettling legacy of the merchants of misery and uncover the disturbing ways their actions continue to cast a shadow over our world today. Laid the groundwork for the scientific and philosophical inquiries that would shape the modern world. The enduring questions raised by these medieval scholars continue to inspire new discoveries and fresh perspectives on the nature of humanity and our place in the cosmos. This approach rejected the traditional reliance on faith and dogma and instead sought to reconcile religious teachings with philosophical inquiry. Another school of thought was that of the Via Antiqua, or the Old Way, which held to more traditional views on theology and philosophy. This group emphasized the importance of religious authority and the teachings of the past. These different schools of thought led to lively debates and discussions among scholars, helping to stimulate new ideas and perspectives on the nature of humanity. He grappled with the question of human free will and the compatibility of human nature with divine omnipotence. Many Christians, for instance, questioned the prevailing belief in the immortality of the soul and the possibility of salvation outside of Christianity. Others challenged the prevailing view of women as inferior beings and argued for their equal access to education and economic opportunities. Despite facing persecution and marginalization, these voices played an important role in challenging the status quo and paving the way for greater tolerance and understanding in later centuries. Scotus argued that while God knew all things, including the future of humanity, humans still had free will and were capable of making choices that could change their destiny. His ideas were highly controversial and would later come into conflict with those of Thomas Aquinas, but they represented an important step in the development of natural theology and the study of human nature, proposed a more empirical approach to understanding the human condition. Bacon argued that knowledge should be acquired through observation and experimentation, rather than relying solely on theological teachings or the writings of ancient authorities. He believed that the human mind was capable of understanding the complexities of the universe, and that through careful study and analysis, we could uncover the secrets of our own nature. His ideas paved the way for the scientific revolution that would occur centuries later, but they also challenged the prevailing religious orthodoxy of the time, leading to his persecution and imprisonment by the Catholic Church. Yet, even today, the boundary between our material existence and our intangible sense of self remains one of humanity's most perplexing mysteries. In this episode, we'll explore how medieval scholars grappled with this timeless question and how their ideas shaped our understanding of human nature. The medieval era in Europe lasted from the 5th to the 15th century and was a time when faith and reason played a pivotal role in people's lives. As science and technology advanced, medieval thinkers began to challenge long-held beliefs and explore new ideas about the nature of reality. At the center of this intellectual revolution was the question of what made humans unique. Were we simply complex machines governed by the same laws of physics and chemistry as rocks and rivers? Or was there something more, some intangible essence that set us apart from the rest of creation? One of the earliest and most influential theories on human nature during the medieval period was that of St. Augustine. Building on the work of his predecessors, Augustine argued that the human soul was the seat of our consciousness and personality, and that it was immortal, surviving the death of the body and continuing to exist in some form after death. This idea was deeply rooted in Christian theology and had a profound impact on medieval thought, shaping everything from religious art to philosophical treatises. But Augustine wasn't the only one exploring these profound questions. Another important figure in the study of human nature during the medieval period was the English philosopher John Duns Scotus. The medieval period saw the emergence of various schools of thought and philosophies that aimed to understand the complexities of human nature. However, it is essential to acknowledge that not all medieval scholars were comfortable with the prevailing views on human nature. As the medieval period drew to a close in exploring these timeless questions, in a world where innovation and entrepreneurship are celebrated, from the halls of medieval medical schools to the modern boardrooms of healthcare corporations, as we navigate this complex terrain, ask critical questions. If you found this exploration thought-provoking and want to support us in shedding light on important social issues, please like and share our content. And thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode. To get a tattoo, you have to go to a specialized parlor, find an artist you like, choose a design you want to commit to your body permanently, and hope you don't regret it later. This whole process can be stressful. It is a good thing, then, that we can spare ourselves all this trouble by just downloading a nice digital ink and being done with it. Oh wait, hold on. Actually, I think I need to go see that tattoo artist after all. It is easy to forget that our modern world didn't always have the things we take for granted now. They were an advanced form of first aid, representing actual medical techniques. And the most important procedure to know was cauterization, which involved burning the wound to stop the bleeding. Other times they were shaped like animals or human body parts, and in other cases they were just abstract shapes. Some were even engraved with images of the Virgin Mary, but the designs weren't just symbolic. They had practical uses too, especially since literacy was low and it was hard to share written instructions. But there was another advantage to having a living doctor on board. Patients could ask questions, which brings us back to that Ted hiker analogy. Let's say you're injured and covered in sweat. Would you want a robot to give you a first aid kit tattooing medical knowledge onto the body, helped pioneer the field of dermatology, and showed us the mystery of Stonehenge, or check out why ancient Greek and Roman statues are actually brilliantly colored? That the skin is a huge source of information about our overall health, but it is also part of the reason it took so long for us to accept tattoos as a normal part of society. We rejected an idea that was centuries ahead of its time, and the repercussions are still felt today. And leave, or would you prefer an experienced doctor who could tend to your wounds and monitor your condition over time? Robots will surely get better, but human empathy is hard to replace. And the tattooed doctors offered something their robotic counterparts still haven't caught up on: compassion. Doctors would use some of the same tools to treat warts, ringworms, and other skin conditions. It was about helping someone in pain. All those tattoos were essentially visual reminders for both the doctor and the patient. So why did this practice fade away? Even though the benefits seemed obvious, you see, tattooing medical knowledge onto yourself took years of dedicated study and plenty of ink. But there was no official certification program, and anyone who wanted to could start tattooing. This led to two problems. First, there'd be inconsistency in quality. Someone who spent years studying wouldn't tattoo the same way or with the same level of knowledge as someone who just memorized a few techniques. Second, it created an us versus them mentality. People who thought they had the medical knowledge to tattoo themselves felt superior to those who didn't. But it is hard to argue that someone is a bad doctor when they literally have their expertise branded onto their skin. It turns out that carrying a doctor around with you has its downsides too. To make this quick and simple, doctors would brand the technique right onto their patient's skin. They'd spend years observing and learning before practicing on their own. But they also got experience by performing procedures on family members and friends. That's not a bad thing, except that eventually those people ran out. When every family member and willing volunteer had a tattoo, it was hard to get more practice. Even worse, it could be tempting to tattoo someone who hadn't fully consented, like an unsuspecting traveler who passed out after drinking too much. Without strict guidelines on informed consent and medical ethics, it was difficult to separate the desire to help people from the desire to just practice on someone. How would they know whether the leg was broken cleanly or if there was an open fracture? A clean break would get a different tattoo from one that needed immediate setting. There are even reports of doctors tattooing anatomical diagrams onto their patients, helping them understand exactly where the injury was and how it should be treated. In theory, a single person could carry all this knowledge on their person at all times and help anyone in need. So when someone was injured, the doctor would pull out a branding iron and sear the wound. It sounds horrifying, and it was, but it saved lives. This process was better than letting nature run its course. Plus, it only had to be done once. The tattoo would remain on the patient's body for life, meaning one treatment could save that person's life years into the future. In effect, each tattoo became its own personal surgeon. But how did this work? The answer lies in the techniques doctors use to stop bleeding, combat infection, and deal with traumatic injuries. You see, wounds that didn't receive prompt treatment would quickly fill with dirt and bacteria, leading to infection and possible gangrene. For small cuts, bruises, and scrapes, it was easy enough to tell patients how to wash and dress the wound. But a traveler who cut their hand on a wild rose bush wouldn't need instructions. They'd need immediate treatment. And that's where the tattooed doctor came in. So many advances that we rely on daily were hard-won or products of wild chance that may never repeat themselves. A cut fruit or vegetable could mean a trip to the emergency room for us, but for them it meant almost certain gangrene and possible death. That's because in the Middle Ages, there was no penicillin or other antibiotics to fight off deadly infections. Small injuries could easily turn gangrenous if bacteria entered the wound. And at that point, the only remedy was to amputate the affected limb. But that kind of surgery was rare. Not everyone who needed it could get it, especially because of a major problem with medical expertise. But sometimes new inventions are lost before they ever become widely used because of unpredictable events. And that's what happened to a kind of tattoo that could have saved countless lives in the Middle Ages. Medieval people lived in a brutal world where the threat of sudden sickness or injury hung over them constantly. See, getting expert medical care wasn't as easy as making an appointment. There weren't really doctors in villages or towns. And traveling to see a doctor wasn't simple. I'm not talking about a medical student writing alone to observe, but a real doctor whose presence could save your life. That might sound like science fiction, but this method actually existed. The answer to medieval first aid was tattoos. The solution to the problem of incompetent village healers and the impossibility of reaching a real doctor was to apply the expertise of both directly to the patient as skin. Doctors started tattooing knowledge onto themselves. Roads were rough, dangerous, and often non-existent. Plus, there was no way to predict when or where you'd need medical attention. If you were unlucky enough to be injured or fall violently ill far from home, you'd probably die. But there was a way to prevent this fate. A solution so elegant it seems insane that we stopped using it. What if you could carry a fully qualified doctor around with you? These tattoos weren't decorative or ceremonial. The goal was to transfer a collection of treatments to someone who needed them immediately. So what kind of designs were these tattooed doctors using? Sometimes the branding irons had simple geometric patterns that signified certain treatments. And those aren't the only techniques that would have been useful to tattoo onto a person. Imagine stumbling upon a hiker with a broken bone. Of course, having a walking medical encyclopedia wouldn't have hurt either. It wasn't just about curing or treating illnesses. Doctors usually got their training by working under someone else. But maybe the biggest problem was the doctors themselves. But while this practice faded from view, it had lasting impacts. Now watch. Hopelessness, a feeling of utter despair, of believing that nothing you do will make a difference, that no action you take can alter your fate. It is an emotion we typically associate with those trapped in dire circumstances, those facing extreme adversity. Yet, what if I told you that hopelessness was how it was disguised and rationalized by those in authority? Medieval physicians developed elaborate diagnostic procedures. When you believed that the pills they prescribed or the surgery they recommended would bring you relief. And then imagine the devastation when those treatments not only failed to deliver. With the advent of Islam and the subsequent spread of Muslim rule across the Middle East and North Africa, Jews found themselves increasingly integrated into non-Jewish societies. And Wang Weiyi, a polymath and inventor, combined traditional Chinese medicine with new discoveries and inventions to create innovative treatments and medical instruments. The invention of acupuncture during this period is one example of the practical application of traditional knowledge to solve medical problems. These innovations in medical science were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader cultural movement that emphasized observation, experimentation, and the application of knowledge to real-world problems. This integration led to unique opportunities for cultural exchange and intellectual collaboration. I want to encourage you to think about the broader implications of what we have discussed today. How do these ideas manifest in our world today? Are there situations where those in authority use helplessness and powerlessness to control and manipulate those who are suffering? How does the historical context of medieval medicine shed light on these issues? By understanding the past, we can better navigate and address the challenges we face in the present. Your insights and perspectives are valuable, so please don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. By Islamic scholars and Jewish thinkers stand in stark contrast to the stagnation and superstition that characterized much of medieval Europe. They serve as a reminder that the history of science is not a linear progression, but a complex tapestry woven from the contributions of diverse cultures across time. Jewish physicians like Moses Maimonides, known for his medical encyclopedia, commentary on the canon of medicine, and his Mishnat Torah, a comprehensive legal and philosophical text, epitomized the fusion of medical science and religious learning that characterized much of Jewish thought during this period. For it is only when we aggregate such experiences that we begin to understand the collective trauma inflicted by medieval medicine. It was a system of oppression. It was also a time of innovation for others. During this period, Islamic scholars made significant strides in various fields, including mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, whose book, The Canon of Medicine, became a standard medical text in both Islamic and European universities for centuries, exemplified this tradition of preserving and advancing knowledge. Their emphasis on observation and experimentation laid the groundwork for future scientific advancements. The ordinary man and woman who sought help for their ailments, but received instead a condemnation of their lifestyle and character. Their bodies became battlegrounds not just for disease. A fever rising was not a response to invasion by pathogens, but a failure of the individual to live in accordance with the dictates of medicine and religion, who submit to painful procedures in the belief that healing will follow, who exhaust their resources pursuing treatments that cannot work. Experience not only physical suffering, but the additional torment of betrayed faith. This betrayal was particularly acute because medieval medicine demanded so much from its patients while delivering so little in return. Treatments were often more painful than the diseases they supposedly cured. Patients were required to endure bloodletting until they fainted, purging until they were dangerously dehydrated, surgical procedures without anesthesia, and pharmaceutical preparations that were essentially poison. They submitted to these orals because they trusted that their physicians knew what they were doing, that the immediate suffering would lead to eventual relief. When relief failed to materialize, when the patient's condition worsened or death approached despite compliance with medical advice, the fault was invariably placed on the patient rather than the treatment. They had not bled enough, had not purged completely. This systematic victim blaming meant that medical failure was always the patient's fault. If you didn't get well, it was because you weren't trying hard enough. Never mind that you had already endured a battery of torturous treatments. Never mind that your ailment might have had no cure in this world or any other. Complex pharmaceutical preparations and detailed treatment protocols that rival anything found in the modern world for their intricacy and systematization. But all of this intellectual apparatus was built on foundations of sand, theoretical assumptions that bore little relationship to biological reality. For the medieval patient, this meant living in a world where medical authority was both omnipresent and useless. They were surrounded by people who claimed to understand their bodies and their ailments, who spoke with confidence about causes and cures, who demanded payment and obedience for their services. Yet when crisis struck, when real healing was needed, these authorities had nothing meaningful to offer. That those very people who held the power to alleviate suffering did so only to preserve the illusion of their own relevance. Welcome to my channel. This is part 3 of our series on the history of medical science. Today we will be looking at the Middle Ages. This is a story of how hopelessness was sold as hope, how pain and death were accepted not as problems to be solved, when their own power rested on maintaining existing social hierarchies. A peasant who died of a preventable disease was simply replaced by another peasant. The suffering of the common people was seen as natural and inevitable, not as a problem requiring a solution. Even among medical practitioners themselves, there was little recognition that their methods might be fundamentally flawed. The entire system of medical education was based on memorizing ancient texts rather than observing actual patients. Students learned to recite Galen's theories about blood flow without ever dissecting a human body to see how circulation actually worked. They studied elaborate charts of astrological influences on health without conducting controlled experiments to test whether these influences existed. This educational approach created generations of physicians who were intellectually equipped to debate theoretical points, but practically incapable of helping real patients. They could discourse learnedly about the proper balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors, but they could not recognize the symptoms of common diseases or understand how infections spread. But as lessons to be endured, in the comforting embrace of a medieval cathedral, the church taught that suffering was spiritually beneficial, that earthly pain was merely temporary compared to eternal salvation, and that accepting one's afflictions with patience and faith was the highest virtue. While these teachings may have provided some comfort to the suffering, they also serve to discourage any serious effort to improve medical knowledge or develop better treatments. Political authorities, meanwhile, have little incentive to invest in medical advancements. The result was a medical system that was simultaneously highly sophisticated in its theoretical complexity and utterly primitive in its practical effectiveness. The psychological damage of this false hope may have been worse than no hope at all. Imagine living in such a world. Think of a time when you placed your trust in a medical professional. If the Middle Ages was a time of darkness for many, the Jewish diaspora also contributed significantly to medical understanding during this time. Meanwhile, in China, the Song dynasty witnessed significant advancements in medical knowledge. Figures like Li Gao, a physician and philosopher, the advancements in mathematics. As we bring this episode to a close,